Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of medieval Europe, where wives lived entire secret lives that history almost forgot. Picture this. No streetlights, no electric glow, just endless darkness falling at 4 in the afternoon during winter. While their husbands slept, medieval women worked, healed, created, and built networks of power that thrived only after sunset. These were not the silent, obedient wives you imagine. These were the spinners of moonlight, the brewers of dawn, the keepers of life and death. And tonight, we are going to uncover what they were really doing when darkness fell. So before we step into the medieval night together, I would love it if you could help this channel grow. If you enjoy uncovering these hidden histories with me, please subscribe, give this video a like, and share it with someone who loves a good mystery. And I am curious, where are you watching from right now? Are you tucked in bed in California? Or maybe watching the sunrise in London? Drop a comment and let me know. I truly love hearing from you. Now, let us dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the story carry you back 800 years to a world that only came alive when the sun went down. Imagine you are standing in a small English village in the year 1263. The sun has just set, and the world transforms completely. There is no gradual dimming like we experience today, no streetlights clicking on one by one to hold back the dark. Instead, it is as if someone has pulled a thick black curtain across the entire sky. Within minutes, you cannot see your hand in front of your face. This is true darkness, the kind that swallows sound and makes every shadow seem alive. For us, night is just daytime with the lights on. We walk to our refrigerators at 2 in the morning without a second thought. We scroll our phones in bed, the blue light pushing back against sleep. But in medieval Europe, night was a completely different realm. It was dangerous, unknown, filled with real threats and imagined terrors. The church taught that demons and evil spirits roamed freely after dark. Village laws required everyone to be indoors after curfew, with fires carefully banked and shutters closed tight. Night was the domain of thieves, wolves, and wandering souls, and yet, for medieval wives, night was when their real work began. Let me paint you a more specific picture. It is January, perhaps around the year 1300, in a modest stone cottage just outside York. The dwelling has thick walls, but still the cold seeps through. There is one main room with a hearth and a small sleeping chamber beyond. The husband, let us call him Thomas, is a free tenant farmer. He's eaten his supper of bread, pottage and ale, and now he's asleep. Farmers needed to wake before dawn, so sleeping early was not a choice but a necessity. The children are also asleep, bundled together for warmth under sheepskins. But Margaret, Thomas's wife, is wide awake, and she will be for hours yet. Here is something that will surprise you. Medieval women were chronically sleep-deprived far more than men. We know this from a beautiful and heartbreaking piece of evidence, a medieval poem called Piers Plowman, written around 1370. The poem describes the life of poor women, and there is a line that has haunted me since I first read it. It talks about women waking up nights to rise on the bedside to rock the cradle. That simple phrase tells us so much. These women were not getting full nights of sleep. They were up multiple times, tending to crying babies, nursing infants, comforting frightened children. But that was only part of it. Because while Margaret rocks the cradle with one hand, do you know what she is doing with the other? She is spinning wool. Let that image settle in your mind. A woman in the dead of night, in a room lit by a single tallow candle that costs precious money, rocking a cradle with one forefoot while her hands never stop moving, pulling, twisting, spinning raw wool into thread. This is not a romantic scene from a fairy tale. This is survival. The light in Margaret's cottage comes from a candle made of animal fat, tallow, which was what most common people could afford. These candles smoked terribly, filling the room with a greasy smell. They sputtered and dripped. They gave off a dim, flickering light that made shadows dance on the walls. A single tallow candle might cost a penny, which does not sound like much until you realise that a penny was what a labourer earned for a full day of work. Light was expensive. Light was a luxury measured out carefully. Wealthy households used beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and brighter and smelled of honey instead of burnt fat. But those cost 10 times as much. For people like Margaret, every hour of candlelight had to be justified by productivity. You did not burn a candle to read a book for pleasure. Books were rare and most women could not read anyway. You burned a candle because you were creating something of value. You were spinning thread that could be woven into cloth that could be sold or used. You were turning darkness into income. And medieval women desperately needed to contribute income because, as we know from historical records, women were paid far less than men for the same work. When women did day labour during harvest, they received about half to 2/3 of what men earned. This wage gap has been documented extensively by historians like Judith Bennett, who studied medieval English economy. So women found other ways. They brewed ale in their homes and sold it to neighbours. They spun thread during every spare moment. They raised chickens and sold eggs. They made cheese. They gathered herbs and sold them. But here's the thing that I find most fascinating. So much of this work happened at night. Why? Because during the day, medieval wives had endless other tasks. Listen to this from historical records: cooking over an open fire, which meant constantly tending flames and stirring pots, hauling water from the well or stream back and forth because a household needed dozens of gallons per day, washing clothes in cold streams, a brutal task that left hands raw and red, caring for children, obviously, feeding chickens, geese, pigs, tending the kitchen garden where herbs and vegetables grew, making bread, which was not just mixing and baking, but first grinding grain into flour with a handstone, preserving food for winter by salting, drying, smoking, sweeping floors covered in rushes that needed to be changed, emptying chamber pots. The list goes on and on. A medieval poem that I mentioned, Piers Plowman, describes women who were burdened with children and landlord's rent. It talks about how they had woe in wintertime and hunger. The poem says, and I am paraphrasing here because medieval English is hard to understand, that it is too pitiful to fully describe the suffering of these women. So when did they do the work that might actually earn money? At night, after everyone else slept. In those stolen hours between putting children to bed and dawn arriving, medieval wives had a second shift. And this second shift was how many of them kept their families from complete poverty. Margaret sits by her dying fire with her spindle and distaff, tools we will talk much more about soon. The distaff is essentially a stick that holds the raw wool. The spindle is a weighted stick that spins and twists the fibres into thread. Her hands move in a rhythm she has known since childhood, since her own mother taught her. She does not need to think about it. Pull the fibre, let the spindle drop and spin, wind the new thread. Pull, spin, wind, meditative and endless. Outside she can hear the wind moving through the thatch roof above. Somewhere in the village a dog barks. The night is not silent, but it is quieter than day. There is something about working in this quiet darkness that feels almost sacred. No one is asking her for anything, no one needs her attention. For these few hours her hands belong to herself. But let me be clear, this was not some peaceful meditative choice. This was necessity. This was exhaustion pushed past its breaking point. Medieval women suffered from what we would now recognize as chronic sleep deprivation, and it affected their health terribly. Historians examining skeletal remains from medieval graves have found evidence that women, on average, died younger than men. They had higher rates of malnutrition-related bone damage. They had dental problems from inadequate diet. They had wear patterns on their bones from repetitive grinding labour. And yet they persisted, night after night after night. Now, I want to zoom out for a moment and talk about the bigger picture of medieval night, because understanding why women worked at night means understanding what night meant in this world. In medieval thinking, the world was divided into light and darkness in ways both practical and spiritual. God was light. Christ was often depicted with a golden halo. Churches were built to capture sunlight through stained glass, creating pools of coloured radiance. Daytime was for honest work, for community, for the business of living. Night, on the other hand, was ambiguous. It was when spirits walked, when witches supposedly held their gatherings, when demons tempted the faithful. The church held services called matins and vigils in the middle of the night specifically to combat the darkness with prayer and candlelight. Monks and nuns would rise at 2 or 3 in the morning to sing hymns, believing this pushed back against evil. But for lay people, for ordinary men and women, night was mostly about danger and economics. Laws existed in most medieval towns requiring people to be indoors after dark. These curfew laws, the word literally means cover fire, from the French couvre-feu, required everyone to bank their fires and essentially shut down for the night. Night watchmen walked the streets carrying lanterns, looking for anyone breaking curfew. You could be fined or even jailed for being out after dark without a good reason. So why did women risk it? Why did women like Margaret stay up working when rest was so desperately needed? Because their labour, particularly textile work, was absolutely crucial to the medieval economy in ways we can barely imagine today. Let me give you some numbers that will make this clear. A piece of cloth just 1 yard square, picture something a bit bigger than a large pillowcase, required 1,800 yards of thread. That is just over 1 mile of thread for a single square yard of fabric. Now think about how much fabric a family needed. A simple wool tunic required about 4 yards of fabric. That is 4 miles of thread for a single garment. And that is just one person's basic clothing. A family of 5 would need tunics, undergowns, hose, cloaks, blankets, sheets, napkins, towels. We are talking about dozens of miles of thread that needed to be spun, all by hand, all by women, before any weaving could even begin. And there is more. Thread was currency. In some regions, particularly in Scandinavia and Iceland, woven cloth actually was currency. People paid taxes in cloth. They traded cloth for other goods. A skilled woman who could spin fine, even thread, was contributing real measurable wealth to her household. So Margaret sits in the candlelight, and her fingers pull and twist, and slowly, so slowly, the pile of raw wool decreases, while the cop of thread on her spindle grows. In a good night, working from around 9 until past midnight, she might spin enough thread to weave an inch or 2 of fabric. It would take her weeks to prepare enough thread for a single garment. But here is something beautiful hidden in all this exhaustion: community. Because Margaret was not always alone in the night. Often, especially during the long winter months, women would gather together. 2 or 3 neighbours might meet in one cottage, bringing their spinning, pooling their candlelight. They would talk quietly, sharing news and gossip and stories. They would sing work songs, rhythmic, repetitive tunes that matched the motion of spinning. They would teach younger women and girls the skill, passing down knowledge that had travelled through generations. These gatherings were called spinnings or rockings, and they were precious. Historical records and church court documents sometimes mention them, usually because the church was suspicious of women gathering without male supervision. Priests worried about what women might talk about, what secrets they might share. There were occasional decrees trying to prevent these nighttime gatherings, claiming they led to gossip and slander and worse, but the women continued anyway, because in those dark hours they created something beyond thread. They created networks of support and knowledge that men knew nothing about. They shared information about childbirth and healing herbs. They discussed which merchants gave fair prices. They warned each other about dangerous situations. They built a kind of parallel society that existed only after sunset. This is what I mean by secret night lives. Not that women were doing anything forbidden or scandalous, though we will get to some of that in later parts of this story, but that they were living entire dimensions of existence that were invisible to men and largely unrecorded by history. Because who wrote the history books? Men. Who wrote the laws and the chronicles and the poems? Men. Who decided what was important enough to preserve? Men. So much of what medieval women did, especially at night, simply never got written down. It was considered too ordinary, too domestic, too beneath notice. But it was not beneath notice. It was the foundation of everything. As Margaret's candle burns lower, and she watches it carefully because candles are expensive and must not be wasted, she thinks about tomorrow, or rather today, since it is now well past midnight. In a few hours she will need to wake and start the fire, heat water, prepare breakfast. Thomas will rise and head to the fields. The children will wake hungry and demanding. The whole cycle will begin again. But for now, in the quiet pocket of darkness, her hands move in their ancient rhythm. Pull, spin, wind, pull, spin, wind. Outside, the medieval night continues its slow turn toward dawn. Somewhere in the village, another woman sits by another dim candle, doing the same work, and another, and another. An invisible network of tired hands creating the fabric of civilization, one strand at a time. This is where our story truly begins, with women and firelight and the secrets that thrive in shadow. In our next part, we're going to look even more closely at this spinning work, at the tools women used, the incredible skill it required, and the surprising economic power that came from it. We are going to meet the Silk Women of London, an entire guild of female textile workers who built businesses that rivaled those of men. We are going to discover just how much the medieval world depended on these spinners of moonlight, and what happened when that dependence was forgotten. But for now, let Margaret's story settle into your mind. Let yourself feel the weight of that spindle in your hand, the scratch of raw wool against your fingers, the dim circle of candlelight holding back an ocean of dark. This was the reality for millions of medieval wives, night after night after night, their hands never still, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, their bodies aching, but their spirits, their spirits were stronger than anyone knew. The medieval night is just beginning to reveal its secrets. Stay with me as we go deeper into the darkness and discover the women who truly owned it. So now we know that Margaret and countless women like her spent their nights spinning by candlelight. But I want you to understand just how extraordinary this work actually was. Because when we hear the word spinning, we might think it sounds quaint, maybe even relaxing, like something you would do as a hobby on a quiet Sunday afternoon. But medieval spinning was nothing like that. It was a highly technical skill that took years to master, required incredible physical stamina, and was quite literally the backbone of the entire European economy. Let me show you what I mean. Hold your hands out in front of you right now. Go ahead, actually do it. Look at your fingers. Now imagine that those fingers are your most valuable tools. Not a laptop, Not a smartphone, not even a hammer or a plough, just your hands. Because for a medieval woman, her ability to spin fine, even thread, determined her economic survival and her social status. A woman who could spin exceptionally fine thread so thin and strong that it could be woven into high-quality fabric, that woman had power. The tools themselves were deceptively simple. There was the distaff, which was essentially a wooden stick about 3 feet long with a fork or cage at one end. You would load this with prepared wool or flax, your raw material. Women often tucked the distaff under one arm or stuck it in their belt so their hands were free. Then there was the spindle, which looked like a stick with a weight on it called a whirl. The whirl was usually made of stone, clay or wood, and it was carefully balanced because the physics of spinning depended on it. Here is how it worked. You would pull a few fibres from the distaff with one hand, give the spindle a twist with the other to set it spinning like a top, and as it spun, the twist would travel up into the fibres, turning them into thread. When you had a length of thread, you would wind it onto the spindle and start again. Pull, twist, wind, pull, twist, wind. Over and over, thousands of times per day. Now this might sound monotonous, but it required extraordinary skill. The thread had to be even, not thick in some places and thin in others. It had to have the right amount of twist. Too little and it would fall apart, too much and it would kink and tangle. You had to maintain consistent tension. You had to keep the spindle spinning at just the right speed. And you had to do all of this while probably also watching children, or walking to market, or doing half a dozen other tasks, because medieval women were masters of multitasking. There are medieval illustrations, manuscripts painted by monks, that show women spinning in the most unlikely situations. There is one famous image of a woman spinning while riding a horse. Another shows a woman spinning while she walks through a forest. And yes, there is even a cheeky medieval illustration of a woman spinning while in bed with a man. Medieval humour, apparently, was not so different from ours. The joke was that women were never without their distaffs. It became a symbol of womanhood itself. In fact, the word distaff came to mean the female line of a family. You might hear about the distaff side of an inheritance, meaning it came through the mother. And the word spinster, which we now use to mean an unmarried woman, originally just meant a woman who spins, because every woman spun. It was that universal. But here is where it gets really interesting. How much spinning are we actually talking about? I mentioned in the last part that 1 square yard of fabric needed 1,800 yards of thread. Let me break that down further so you can truly appreciate the mathematics of medieval textile work. A historian named Katrine Kania, who is a textile archaeologist, yes, that is a real job, and how amazing is that? She did calculations on medieval spinning. She looked at medium quality wool fabric, nothing fancy, just everyday cloth. This fabric had about 15 threads per centimetre in both the warp, those are the vertical threads on a loom, and the weft, which are the horizontal threads that weave through. That means 1 square centimetre of this ordinary fabric contained 30 centimetres of thread. Now scale that up to 1 metre of fabric, which is about 40 inches wide. To weave just 1 centimetre of length at 1 metre width, you needed 3,000 centimetres of thread. That is 30 metres, and to weave 1 full metre of fabric, you needed 3,000 metres of thread. That is almost 2 miles of thread for just 1 metre of cloth. Are you starting to see the scope of this? A simple woman's dress might require 5 metres of fabric, that is 10 miles of thread. 10 miles! All spun by hand, all created by women sitting in the dim light of tallow candles, fingers moving in that ancient rhythm hour after hour after hour. And medieval people needed a lot of cloth. You might think they just wore the same outfit day after day, but that is not accurate. People had undergarments, outer garments, cloaks, hoods, hose, nightclothes. They had linens for beds, they had tablecloths and napkins, they had bags and sacks for storage, they had swaddling for babies. Wealthier homes had tapestries and wall hangings. Churches needed altar cloths and vestments. Ships needed sails. Imagine how much thread went into a single sail for a medieval merchant vessel. The demand for thread was absolutely endless, and women's hands supplied it all. Now, I want to introduce you to a group of women who turned this skill into serious economic power. They were called the Silk Women of London, and their story is absolutely fascinating. In the 15th century, we're talking about the 1400s now, there was a thriving community of women in London who worked exclusively with silk. Not wool or linen, but silk, which was an imported luxury material that came all the way from Asia along the Silk Road. Working with silk required even more skill than wool because the fibres were finer and more delicate. These women were not just spinners, though. They were throsters, which meant they twisted raw silk into yarn. They were weavers who made ribbons, laces, and decorative trim. They were makers of buttons, tassels, fringes, and cords, and they were respected as skilled artisans. A historian named Marion Dale studied these silk women back in the 1930s, and what she found was remarkable. These women ran businesses. They had apprentices, other women and girls who paid to learn the trade. They sold directly to wealthy clients, including nobility. They supplied the royal court with silk goods. Some of them became quite prosperous. They owned property. They appeared in legal documents as independent business owners. Their work included making cauls, which were decorative nets for holding women's hair in place. They made points, which were the laces used to tie clothing together before buttons became common. They made elaborate cords that hung from knights' swords and from the wax seals on official documents. These were not simple items. They required artistry and precision. And here is what I find most powerful. In 1455, the Silk Women of London became some of the first workers in English history to petition Parliament for protection against foreign competition. Think about that. A group of women, in the medieval period, collectively organised to protect their trade. They argued that imported silk goods were threatening their livelihoods, and they asked the government to impose restrictions. That is not women sitting passively at home. That is women engaging in economics and politics. But, and there's always a but in these stories, the silk women never formed an official guild. Guilds were the powerful organisations that controlled most trades in medieval cities. If you were in a guild, you had legal protection, political influence, and a support network. But very, very few guilds admitted women as full members. Why did the Silk Women not form their own guild? Historians have debated this. Some think it was because women were conditioned to see themselves as part of families rather than as workers in their own right. Some think women feared that forming a guild would bring too much male attention and interference. Some think it was simply that the patriarchal society made it nearly impossible for women to organise that way. Whatever the reason, the lack of a guild eventually hurt them. By the 1500s, men began taking over the silk trade in London. These men formed a guild, the Worshipful Company of Silk Men, and they slowly pushed women out of the business that women had built. Within a few generations, the silk women were mostly gone from the historical record. But for a brief shining moment, they showed what women could achieve with skill, determination, and control over their own labour. And so much of that labour happened at night. Let me paint you another scene. It is London, around the year 1470. A woman named Alice, we do not know her last name, but women like her existed, runs a small silk workshop in her home near Cheapside, which was the main market district. Alice is a widow, which actually gives her more legal freedom than a married woman would have. As a widow, she can own property, make contracts and run a business in her own name. During the day, Alice supervises 2 apprentices, both young women learning the trade. They prepare the raw silk, which arrives in skeins that must be carefully wound and organised. They set up the small looms. They consult with customers who come to order custom work. Perhaps a nobleman needs new silk points for his doublet, or a wealthy merchant's wife wants an elaborate caul decorated with gold thread. But the real work, the detailed, painstaking work of actually throwing the silk and weaving the intricate patterns, that happens at night. Because during the day, there are too many interruptions. Customers arriving, apprentices asking questions, merchants at the door selling supplies or buying finished goods. The noise of London, and medieval London, was incredibly noisy, with vendors shouting, animals braying, church bells ringing every hour. At night, the city quiets. Alice lights her beeswax candles. She can afford these because her work is profitable. The golden light is steady and clear. She sits at her small loom, and her fingers fly through the silk threads, creating patterns that seem almost magical in their complexity. This is when she does her finest work. This is when she creates the pieces that will command the highest prices, and she is not alone in the night. In workshops all over the textile districts of London, in Cheapside, in Cordwainer Street, in the alleys around St. Paul's Cathedral, other women are doing the same. Some are working with silk like Alice. Others are working with fine linen. Some are embroidering elaborate designs onto church vestments. Some are making bone lace, a delicate technique that involves dozens of bobbins and a pattern pricked into parchment. They are creating beauty and value in the darkness. And they are doing it because nighttime work allowed them a degree of economic independence that was otherwise almost impossible for medieval women to achieve. Now, let us zoom out even further and talk about the global scale of this. Because textile production was not just a European phenomenon, women all over the world were spinning and weaving, and this work shaped entire economies. In China, during the same medieval period, silk production was a massive industry, and it was dominated by women. There were imperial workshops where hundreds of women worked on enormous looms, creating the spectacular brocades and damasks that would be exported along the Silk Road. There were also countless small household operations, with women spinning silk in their homes at night, just like their European counterparts. In the Islamic world, women produced the fine cotton fabrics that were so prized in medieval trade. In India, women spun the incredibly fine cotton thread that was woven into muslin, a fabric so lightweight and delicate that an entire bolt could be pulled through a wedding ring. In medieval Egypt, there were wool-working women, mulieres lanificae in Latin documents, who worked in conditions that we would recognize as exploitative. They were paid very little, worked long hours, and their labor enriched merchants and traders who sold the cloth for enormous profits. This was not romantic, this was not charming. This was hard, grinding, repetitive work that damaged women's bodies. Historians who examine medieval skeletons can identify women who did a lot of spinning by the wear patterns on their bones. The repetitive motion created distinctive changes in the bones of the hands, wrists, shoulders. It caused arthritis. It caused vision problems from working in dim light. It caused chronic back pain from hunching over a work. But it was also, and I want to emphasize this, genuinely skilled labour that required some training, practice and expertise. A modern person who tries to spin thread with a drop spindle for the first time will produce something lumpy, uneven, and probably unusable. It takes months of practice to get even moderately good at it. Medieval women started learning as young girls, sometimes as young as 5 or 6 years old, and they practiced for years before they could produce truly fine thread. And here is something that might surprise you. The finest spinners could earn respect and even a kind of fame. There are records of noble women specifically requesting thread from certain skilled spinners because the quality was so superior. There are legal documents where women's spinning skill is mentioned as part of their value in marriage negotiations or inheritance disputes. "She spins exceeding fine" was a compliment that could actually matter in a woman's life. Let me share one more detail that I find absolutely enchanting. In medieval art, in the illuminated manuscripts that monks and nuns created, there are hundreds of images of women spinning, and these images are not always serious. Sometimes they are humorous. There is a whole genre of drolleries in the margins of medieval books, which are like little cartoons, and many of them show women with their distaffs. In one famous manuscript called the Smithfield Decretals from around 1340, there is a marginal illustration of a woman chasing a fox with her distaff. The fox has stolen her goose, and she has hitched up her skirts and is running after him, wielding her distaff like a weapon. In another manuscript, a woman is fighting off a cat with her distaff. In another, two women are having what looks like a distaff duel. These images tell us something important. The distaff was such a constant part of women's lives that it became a symbol, a tool, a weapon, a joke all at once. It was always there, and that means the work was always there. Can you imagine living a life where your most valuable skill was also your burden? Where the thing that gave you economic power was also the thing that exhausted you, that kept you up at night, that made your hands ache and your eyes strain. This was the paradox of medieval women's textile work. But I also want you to imagine the pride, because there was pride in this. When Alice the Silk Woman completes a particularly beautiful caul, when she holds it up to the candlelight and sees the silk gleaming, sees the pattern she created with her own hands, that is her creation. That is her skill made visible. When Margaret the farmer's wife finishes spinning enough thread for her son's new tunic, when she weaves it and sews it and sees him wearing something she made from raw wool all the way to finished garment, that is powerful. These women were not just surviving, they were creating, and they were doing it in the hours that the world had forgotten about, in the quiet darkness when their labour was invisible but absolutely essential. As we move forward in our journey through the medieval night, we are going to encounter more of these secret industries, because textile work was just one part of a much larger story. Up next, we are going to step into another kind of workshop entirely, one filled with bubbling cauldrons and rising steam, with the yeasty smell of fermentation and the sharp tang of hops. We are going to meet the alewives, the women who dominated the medieval brewing industry, and whose pointy hats and cauldrons would eventually transform into our modern image of witches. Yes, you heard that right. The connection between beer and witchcraft is real, and the story is absolutely wild. So stay with me as the night grows deeper and the secrets grow stranger. Picture a woman standing over a massive cauldron in the dead of night. Steam rises around her face as she stirs a bubbling mixture with a long wooden paddle. A black cat sits nearby watching for mice. On her head, she wears a tall pointed hat so she will stand out in tomorrow's market. Outside her door, she has placed a broomstick to signal that her brew is ready. Now, what image just formed in your mind? A witch, right? Of course you pictured a witch. But here is the extraordinary truth. You are actually picturing a medieval businesswoman. You are picturing an alewife, one of the thousands of women who dominated the beer and ale industry in medieval Europe. And the reason our modern image of witches looks exactly like these brewers is one of the darkest and most fascinating stories in medieval history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let us start at the beginning, in the warm, yeasty-smelling workshop of a woman who was simply trying to feed her family. Her name is Joan, and she lives in Oxford in the year 1372. Oxford is a university town, which means it is full of thirsty students and scholars who need a steady supply of ale. and Joan is going to provide it. But first, you need to understand something crucial about medieval life. Everyone drank ale, and I mean everyone. Men, women, children, babies, elderly people, sick people, healthy people. Ale was not a luxury or a vice, it was a necessity. Do you want to know why? Water was dangerous. In the medieval period, there was no understanding of germs or bacteria. People did not know that drinking from a stream contaminated by sewage or animal waste could kill you. But they did know through bitter experience that water often made people sick. They called it bad water, and they avoided it whenever possible. Ale, on the other hand, was safe. Not because medieval people understood the science, they had no idea that the brewing process killed pathogens, but because the empirical evidence was clear. People who drank ale stayed healthier than people who drank water. So ale was consumed at every meal. A typical worker might drink several gallons per week. Children drank a weaker version. Even breakfast included ale. It was hydration, nutrition, and calories all in one. The alcohol content was low, usually around 2 to 3%, just enough to preserve it, but not enough to get people drunk in the middle of the workday. And who made all this ale? Women. Almost exclusively women. Let me give you some numbers that will make this clear. In the year 1577, there was one alehouse for every 142 inhabitants in the average English town. That is an enormous number of alehouses, and the vast majority of them were run by women working out of their own homes. These women were called alewives or brewsters, and brewing was considered so completely a female occupation that some medieval laws and regulations literally refer to it as if no men were involved at all. Why was brewing women's work? Because it was seen as an extension of feeding the family. Women cooked, women baked, women preserved food, so naturally women brewed the household ale. But what started as a domestic duty became a commercial opportunity. Because if you are already brewing several gallons of ale for your own family, why not brew a bit extra and sell it to your neighbours? Why not brew a lot extra and turn it into a real income? And that is exactly what happened. Joan starts her brewing process in the late afternoon, because ale takes many hours to make, and much of that time requires constant attention. She cannot just walk away and do other things. This is skilled, demanding work. Let me walk you through the process so you can appreciate what is involved. First, Joan needs malted barley. Malting is a whole separate process where barley grains are soaked in water until they begin to sprout, then dried in a kiln. This converts the starches in the grain into sugars that can be fermented. Joan probably buys her malt from a professional maltster, though some women did their own malting. She measures out the malt and grinds it into a coarse powder. Then she heats water, and we're talking about heating many gallons of water over an open fire, which is not a small task. When the water reaches the right temperature, she pours it over the ground malt in a large vessel and stirs it thoroughly. This mixture, called the mash, needs to sit for several hours while the hot water extracts the sugars from the grain. Then comes the hard part. Joan needs to separate the liquid, now called wort, from the spent grain. She does this by draining the liquid through a filter, often just a basket lined with straw. This requires care and patience. Then she rinses the grain with more hot water to extract every bit of sugar. She cannot afford to waste anything. Now the wort goes into a big brewing kettle, her cauldron, and she brings it to a boil. And this is where Joan will spend most of her night, because the wort needs to boil for anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, and it must be stirred regularly to prevent scorching. The fire must be fed constantly to maintain the boil. Steam fills the room, making it hot and humid even on a cold night. The smell is rich and grainy, almost bread-like. This is also when Joan adds her flavourings. In 1372, Hops have not yet become standard in England. That will come later. Instead, Joan uses a mixture of herbs and spices called groot. Her particular recipe, passed down from her mother, includes yarrow, mugwort, heather, and a touch of bog myrtle. Other brewers use different combinations. Some add rosemary or sage, others prefer fennel or thyme. These herbs do more than add flavour. Many of them have mild preservative qualities, and some are believed to have medicinal properties. After the boil, Joan needs to cool the wort as quickly as possible. This is crucial because the next step is fermentation, and fermentation requires the right temperature. Too hot, and the yeast will die. She ladles the hot wort into shallow vessels where it can cool faster, spreading them around the room. This is risky because contamination can ruin the batch, but Joan is experienced. She knows to keep everything as clean as possible. And here is where something almost magical happens. Joan does not add yeast, because medieval brewers did not really understand yeast as a living organism. They knew that if they left the cooled wort sitting in the open air, it would begin to ferment on its own. Wild yeasts and bacteria in the air would settle into the liquid and begin their work. Sometimes brewers would keep a bit of foam from a previous batch, they called it balm, and add it to the new wort to help the fermentation along. But they thought of balm as an ingredient, not as living creatures. They had no microscopes, no germ theory, no concept of microbiology. So Joan sets her vessels of wort near the window where fresh air can circulate, and she waits. Within a few hours, bubbles begin to appear. A thick foam rises to the surface. The liquid begins to smell different, sharper, more alcoholic. The yeasts are eating the sugars and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. It looks like the liquid is alive, breathing, moving on its own. Can you imagine not knowing what was really happening? Medieval people thought fermentation was a kind of transformation, almost alchemical. Some thought it was a divine process. The bubbling and foaming seemed like a kind of birth. And in a way they were right. Something new was being created. Joan stays up through most of the night checking on the fermentation, adjusting the temperature, skimming off the foam. She catches some sleep in short snatches, but mostly she watches and waits. By morning she has a batch of fresh ale that will be drinkable within a day or two. It will only stay good for about a week. Medieval ale went sour quickly because it was not heavily hopped like modern beer, so she needs to sell it fast. This is where the tall pointed hat comes in. When Joan goes to the market, she wears a distinctive tall hat so customers can spot her easily in the crowd. This is practical advertising. The hat says, "I am a brewer. I have ale for sale." Other alewives do the same. It is a professional uniform. And the broomstick? When a batch of ale is ready, Joan places a broomstick or a bundle of branches outside her door. This is a signal to neighbours and passers-by, fresh ale available here. It is like hanging an open sign. People know to look for it. The cat is there for a very practical reason. Mice and rats are attracted to the grain stores that every brewer keeps on hand. Cats keep the rodents away, protecting the valuable ingredients. So there you have it. Pointed hat, cauldron, broomstick, cat. Not a witch, just businesswoman in medieval England. But Joan and women like her were remarkably successful. In Oxford specifically, and we have excellent records from Oxford because of the university, there were numerous alewives operating throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. One woman named Maud London appears in the records repeatedly as a prominent brewer. The documents show that she was unmarried, which gave her more legal freedom to run her business. She paid taxes as an independent operator. She was, by medieval standards, a career woman. And Oxford was not unique. Every town, every village had its alewives. In cities, the business could be quite profitable. Records show that some brewers paid substantial guild fees indicating they were running large-scale operations. A successful alewife might employ helpers, might brew multiple batches per week, might supply several alehouses, or even sell to the university colleges. For married women, brewing provided crucial supplemental income. Remember, we talked about the gender wage gap in medieval labour. When a woman worked in the fields at harvest, she earned half to two-thirds of what a man earned for the same work. But brewing was different. Brewing was a skilled trade that women controlled, and they could charge fair prices for their product. A woman who brewed good ale had economic power. For widows, brewing could mean the difference between poverty and survival. A widow who knew how to brew could support herself and her children without needing to remarry or rely on male relatives. She could maintain independence in a society that offered women very few paths to independence. But then something dark began to happen. As the medieval period progressed into the early modern era, we're talking about the 1500s and 1600s now, brewing became more profitable, the industry grew larger. Professional breweries started to appear, run by men with capital to invest in bigger equipment and larger production, and these men looked at the alewives and saw competition. Suddenly, the very things that had been normal and practical about brewing became suspicious. Why did these women work at night, alone, stirring bubbling cauldrons? What were they really putting in those brews? Those herbs they used for flavouring, were those not the same herbs that wise women used for medicine and magic? And why did they have so much knowledge about plants and fermentation and transformation? Was that not suspiciously close to witchcraft? The accusations started slowly. A historian named Judith Bennett, who wrote an important book called Ale, Beer and Brewsters in England, analysed how the medieval people talked about alewives. She found that as early as the 1400s, there were complaints and suspicions. Alewives were accused of cheating customers, of watering down their ale, of using false measures. And here is the insidious part. These accusations always had a gendered element. The assumption was that women were naturally more deceptive. As daughters of Eve, were women not inherently sinful and tricky? So of course an alewife might cheat you. Bennett writes, and this is a direct quote from her research, for medieval people it was easy to link these deceptions with women. Were not women, as daughters of Eve, naturally more deceptive and wicked than men? By such logic, any alewife, no matter how friendly and open, was suspected of being a secret swindler. But it got worse, much worse. By the 1600s, as witch-hunting hysteria swept through Europe, the connection between brewing and witchcraft became explicit. Women who brewed were women who understood herbs. Women who understood herbs were women with suspicious knowledge. Women with suspicious knowledge were potentially witches. The church joined in. There are medieval wall paintings in churches that show alewives in hell, being tormented by demons. Some church teachings actually claim that alewives would be among the last souls remaining in hell after everyone else was saved, because their sin of profiting from making people drunk was so terrible. Let that sink in for a moment. Women who were doing essential work, providing a necessary beverage for their communities, being paid for their skilled labour, they were depicted as hell-bound sinners because they were women, because they were independent, because they made money. And the imagery that had been perfectly innocent, the hat, the cauldron, the cat, the broomstick, became the imagery of evil witchcraft. When witch hunters and propagandists wanted to depict a witch, they drew on the familiar image of the alewife. It was right there, ready-made. There is even a specific example that survived to this day. Mother Louse was a real alewife who lived in Oxfordshire in the 1600s. There is an illustration of her that shows her with her tall pointed hat, her cauldron, and her cat. Today, if you showed that picture to anyone, they would immediately say it is a witch, but it was just a woman trying to make a living. The male brewers who wanted to take over the industry benefited from this suspicion. They formed official guilds that excluded women. They pushed for regulations that made it harder for small home-based brewers to operate. They spread the rumours and fed the fear, and gradually women were forced out of the trade they had dominated for centuries. By the 1600s, brewing in England was becoming a male profession. The few women who remained were either working for male brewers or operating on such a small scale that they barely scraped by. The big money, the official recognition, the guild protections, all went to men. And what happened to the knowledge, the recipes, the skills that women like Joan and Maud London had perfected over generations? Much of it was simply lost. Or it was claimed by men who said they had invented these techniques themselves. This is one of the great tragedies of medieval women's history. Over and over, we see the same pattern. Women create something valuable, men want to control it. Women are pushed out through a combination of legal restrictions and social prejudice, and then history forgets that women were ever involved at all. But I want you to remember Joan tonight standing over her cauldron in the small hours of the morning, stirring her ale with practised hands. I want you to remember Maud London, running her business in Oxford, paying her taxes, making her own way. I want you to remember the thousands of unnamed alewives who kept medieval England hydrated and healthy, one batch at a time. They were not witches, they were brewers, they were businesswomen, they were skilled artisans, and the fact that their tools and their image were twisted into symbols of evil tells us far more about the people who did the twisting than about the women themselves. As the night grows deeper still, we are going to turn to another group of women whose knowledge made them both invaluable and dangerous. We are going to enter the world of the herb women, the healers, the midwives, the wise women who understood plants and bodies in ways that seemed almost magical. Because when you hold the power of life and death in your hands, when you know which leaf will stop a fever and which root will ease childbirth, you hold a kind of knowledge that makes people both grateful and afraid. And fear, as we've already seen, can be a very dangerous thing for women. So let us step carefully into the gardens and the still rooms where medieval medicine was made, where healing happened in whispers, where women guarded secrets that could save lives or end them. There is a garden growing in the darkness, and it holds the power of life and death. It is past midnight in the year 1298, somewhere in the English countryside near Salisbury. Most of the village sleeps, but Eleanor is awake, moving quietly through her herb garden by the light of a waning moon. She carries no lantern, she does not need one. She has walked this garden path so many times that her feet know every stone, every root, every turn, and tonight she has come to harvest. Eleanor is what her neighbours call a wise woman, though that term carries both respect and unease. She is the person they come to when a child burns with fever, when a wound festers and will not heal, when a pregnancy threatens to go terribly wrong. She is the keeper of knowledge that seems almost magical, but is actually something more remarkable. It is generations of careful observation, passed from mother to daughter to granddaughter, refined through centuries of trial and error. And much of her most important work happens at night. You might wonder why. Why harvest herbs in darkness? Why mix remedies by candlelight when daylight would make the work easier and safer? The answers are both practical and deeply rooted in medieval belief. Let me explain both, because understanding this will help you see just how complex and sophisticated these women's knowledge truly was. First, the practical reasons. During the day, Eleanor has other work to do. She is not a professional healer in the way we would understand it today. There are no medical licenses, no clinic, no regular office hours. She is a farmer's wife who happens to have inherited extensive herbal knowledge from her mother. During daylight, she is cooking, cleaning, tending animals, working in the fields during harvest. Her healing work fits into the margins of her life, in the spaces between other obligations, and those spaces are often at night. But there is more to it than that. Medieval people believed, and they were not entirely wrong, that some herbs were more potent when harvested at specific times. Many of these beliefs have some basis in fact that modern science has confirmed. For example, the essential oil content in some plants is higher in the early morning before the sun has been beating down on them. The belief that some herbs should be harvested by moonlight rather than sunlight turns out to have some truth to it. Eleanor reaches for a stand of mugwort, its silvery leaves catching the moonlight. Mugwort is one of her most valued herbs, sometimes called the mother of herbs in medieval poetry. A 9th century monk named Walafrid Strabo wrote a famous poem about herbs where he praised mugwort for its healing properties. Eleanor uses it for women's ailments, to ease difficult menstruation, to help expel the placenta after childbirth, to calm cramping in the womb. She also hangs bundles of it over doorways because it is believed to ward off evil spirits, though Eleanor is practical enough to know that its real value is medicinal, not magical. She cuts the mugwort stems carefully, whispering a prayer as she does. This is not superstition, well, not entirely. The prayer helps her focus, helps her remember which plant is which in the darkness, reminds her of the sacred responsibility she carries. These plants can heal, but they can also harm. The difference between medicine and poison is often just a matter of dose. Next, she harvests pennyroyal, a member of the mint family with a strong, sharp scent. This is a powerful herb, and Eleanor handles it with respect that borders on fear. Pennyroyal can bring on delayed menstruation. It can help with stomach cramps and colds, but in larger doses, it can cause a woman to miscarry. Eleanor knows this. Every wise woman knows this, and they face a terrible moral complexity. When a woman comes to them desperate, already with 6 children and a husband who beats her when he's drunk, already half starved because there is never enough food, pregnant again and terrified, what do you do? The church says all abortion is murder, a mortal sin, but Eleanor has held sobbing women in her arms, has seen children with bellies swollen from hunger, has watched women die in childbirth for the 8th or 9th time. The world is not as simple as the priests make it sound from their pulpits, so she harvests the pennyroyal and she keeps her knowledge close, and when women come to her with certain questions, she speaks very carefully. She might say that pennyroyal is good for bringing on the flowers, which is how medieval people referred to menstruation. She might mention that it should not be taken by pregnant women because it is too strong. She might give just enough information and let the woman make her own decision. This is dangerous knowledge. This is the kind of knowledge that in a few centuries will get women accused of witchcraft and burned. But we are not there yet. Tonight, Eleanor is still safe, still respected. She moves deeper into her garden. Here is rosemary, which every medieval garden had. The flowers can be boiled into a tea that treats dozens of ailments. The leaves under your pillow supposedly guard against nightmares. Whether that is true or not, the scent is certainly calming. The ashes of rosemary wood can be used to clean teeth. It is planted on graves and carried at weddings. Rosemary for remembrance, as Shakespeare will write a few centuries later, but medieval people already knew this. There is lavender, which Eleanor grows not just for its beauty but for its practical uses. Lavender in bath water, when people do bathe, helps with skin ailments. Lavender oil on a burn speeds healing remarkably. How did medieval people discover this? The same way they discovered everything, by trying different things and paying attention to what worked. And here, growing in a shadowed corner, is foxglove. Eleanor does not touch it tonight. Foxglove is dangerous. She knows it can slow a racing heart, can help with certain kinds of illness, but the margin between helping and killing is razor thin. Only the most experienced healers work with foxglove, and even then, with great caution. It will not be until the 18th century that doctors isolate the active compound, digitalis, and understand how it works. But Eleanor already knows it works. She just does not know why. Do you see the sophistication here? These women were empirical scientists. They did not have laboratories or controlled studies, but they had observation, experimentation, and careful record-keeping passed down through oral tradition. They knew which herbs worked for which ailments. They knew how to prepare them, which ones should be boiled, which ones steeped in cold water, which ones dried first, which ones used fresh. They knew dosages, they knew drug interactions, that certain herbs should not be combined because they would counteract each other or create dangerous effects. This was not superstition, this was medicine. Let me tell you about a remarkable woman who represents the pinnacle of this knowledge. Her name was Trota, and she lived in Salerno, Italy, around the year 1090. Salerno was the site of Europe's first medical school, and it was unusual in that it admitted women both as students and as teachers. Trota became one of the most respected medical practitioners of her era. She wrote, or possibly compiled from earlier sources, a text called On Treatments for Women, which became part of a larger compendium known as the Trotula. This was a comprehensive guide to women's medicine, covering everything from conception to childbirth to menopause. It discussed menstrual problems, infertility, difficult labour, postpartum complications. It recommended specific herbs and treatments, many of which actually worked. What is remarkable about the Trotula is that it took women's pain seriously. It advocated for pain relief during childbirth, which was actually controversial. Some medieval theologians argued that women should suffer in childbirth because it was the punishment for Eve's sin. But Trota wrote that pain relief was compassionate and appropriate. She recommended opiates. Yes, medieval doctors had access to opium from poppies and specific herbal mixtures to ease labour. The Trotula circulated throughout medieval Europe in manuscript form. It was translated from Latin into various vernacular languages. Healers read it or had it read to them. Its influence was enormous, and yet for centuries scholars doubted that a woman could have written such a sophisticated medical text. They assumed Trota must have been a man, or that the text must have been written by a group of male doctors. It was not until modern historians, particularly a scholar named Monica Green, did careful research that Trota was recognized as the real historical woman she was. Does that pattern sound familiar? Women create valuable knowledge, and then later generations of men claim it could not possibly have been women who did it. But back to Eleanor in her midnight garden. She has filled her basket with herbs, and now she returns to her cottage. Inside, by candlelight, she begins the work of preparation. Some herbs need to be hung to dry. She suspends them from the ceiling beams in bunches. Some need to be used fresh. These she will prepare immediately. Some need to be steeped in oil or alcohol to extract their active compounds. These she sets up in small jars that will sit for weeks or months. The work is meticulous. She labels each preparation carefully, though she cannot write. Instead, she uses a system of knots tied in string attached to each jar. 3 knots means one thing, 4 knots means another. Or she makes small marks in the wax seal. She has her own code learned from her mother, who learned from her mother. Imagine keeping an entire pharmacopoeia in your head. Imagine knowing hundreds of plants by sight, smell and touch, knowing their uses, their preparations, their dosages, their dangers, knowing which ones work best in combination, knowing which symptoms indicate which illness, knowing when to act and when to wait. All of this knowledge memorized because you cannot write it down, or you can write but books are too expensive, so you must carry it all in your mind and your hands. Eleanor is not the only one doing this work tonight. In villages and towns all across medieval Europe, women are engaged in similar tasks. There are differences based on region and what plants grow locally. A healer in Spain might use different herbs than one in Germany. A woman in coastal Cornwall might incorporate seaweed into her remedies, while a mountain woman in Switzerland uses alpine plants that Eleanor has never seen. But the pattern is the same. Women holding knowledge. Women doing careful work in the margins of the night. Women keeping their communities alive. And it was not just herbs. These wise women knew bone setting, how to realign a broken bone and splint it so it would heal straight. They knew wound care, how to clean a cut, which salves prevented infection, how to recognize when flesh was going bad and needed to be cut away. They knew childbirth, and we will talk much more about that in our next part. But they also knew general nursing, how to bring down a fever, how to encourage someone to eat when they were sick, how to make a patient comfortable when nothing more could be done. There is a medieval medical text from England called Bald's Leech Book, written in Old English around the year 900. It contains hundreds of remedies for various ailments. Many of them are herbal preparations, and while the book was probably compiled by a male doctor named Bald, we can be fairly certain that much of the knowledge it contains originally came from women, because women were the ones at the bedside. Women were the ones washing wounds and applying salves and making healing broths. The medical establishment, male doctors trained at universities, often dismissed this women's knowledge as inferior or superstitious. But here is an interesting fact. When researchers today actually test some of these medieval remedies, they find that a surprising number of them work. There was a recent study where scientists recreated a medieval recipe from Bald's Leech Book, a mixture of garlic, wine and bile salts that was supposed to treat eye infections. They made it exactly according to the 900-year-old instructions. And you know what? It killed antibiotic-resistant staph bacteria. It actually worked. Medieval women were onto something. They did not understand the chemistry or the biology, but they understood the effects. They were practicing evidence-based medicine long before that term existed. Now, I need to talk about the darker side of this knowledge, because it is important for understanding what happened to these women later. The same knowledge that could heal could also harm. A woman who knew which herbs would ease pain also knew which herbs would cause it. A woman who knew how to help a difficult childbirth also knew, at least in theory, how to prevent a birth or end a pregnancy. A woman who knew how to make people better also knew how to make people worse. This made them valuable. It also made them dangerous. There are documented cases from medieval court records of women being accused of poisoning. Some of these accusations were certainly true. Poison was actually used in medieval murders, and women had access to poisonous plants. But many accusations were probably false, stemming from suspicion of women who had too much knowledge, too much power. If a woman made a healing tea and the patient recovered, she was a wise woman, a blessing to the community. If a woman made a healing tea and the patient died anyway, as patients sometimes did despite the best care, she might be accused of murder or witchcraft. The line between healer and poisoner was terrifyingly thin, and it was not always in the woman's control which side of that line people decided she was on. Eleanor knows this risk. Every wise woman knows it, so they are careful. They cultivate relationships with priests when possible, to have the protection of the church. They treat people in front of witnesses. They pray over their remedies, mixing Christian prayer with herbal knowledge, blurring the line between medicine and faith. They never claim their power comes from themselves, always from God, always from the saints. This is both genuine belief and protective strategy. As Eleanor finishes her preparations and banks her fire for what remains of the night, she might pause and say a prayer. Maybe to Saint Hildegard of Bingen, that remarkable 12th century nun who wrote extensively about herbs and healing. Hildegard was a mystic, an abbess, a composer, a writer, and a medical practitioner. Her book Physica described hundreds of plants and their medicinal uses. She even wrote about hops in beer. She was one of the first people to recommend using hops for their healing, bittering, and preserving properties. Hildegard was safe from accusations because she was a nun, because she framed her knowledge as divine revelation. But her knowledge was the same knowledge that Eleanor and thousands of other women held. The night is finally giving way to the earliest hint of dawn. Eleanor allows herself a few hours of sleep, knowing that in the morning someone will probably knock on her door. Someone's child will have a cough that will not go away. Someone will have burned themselves at the fire. Someone will have eaten something that disagreed with them. And Eleanor will open her stores of carefully prepared herbs, will mix the appropriate remedy, will give instructions for its use. She will accept payment, perhaps a chick, perhaps a few eggs, perhaps just a promise of help at harvest time. She will send the person away feeling better, feeling cared for, and she will never write down what she did. She will never receive credit or recognition beyond her small community. History will not remember her name, but the healing will be real, the knowledge will be real, and it will pass to the next generation of women who will guard it and use it and add to it, right up until the moment when that knowledge becomes too dangerous to hold, when wise women become witches in the popular imagination, when healing becomes heresy. We are not there yet in 1298, but the shadows are gathering. In just a moment, we are going to step into the most sacred and secret space of all in medieval women's lives, the birthing chamber. This is where women's knowledge and power reached its absolute peak, where men were forbidden to enter, where life and death hung in the balance with every breath. This is where the wise women became midwives, where their skills were tested to the uttermost, where the bonds between women were forged in blood and pain and triumph. So take a breath, steady yourself, and prepare to enter a realm that was truly women's domain, hidden from history but absolutely central to the survival of the medieval world. Listen, do you hear that sound in the distance? It is the middle of the night in the year 1315, in a village somewhere in Kent, and a woman's cry cuts through the darkness. Not a scream of terror, but a sound of effort, of work, of a body doing what bodies have done since the beginning of human existence. A baby is coming, and in medieval England that means the men must leave. I want you to imagine something that will probably surprise you. There is a law documented in Belgium in the 1500s, but reflecting practices that were common throughout medieval Europe. The law states that a man named Hen van den Dam was fined 15 livres, a substantial sum, for hiding behind a staircase to eavesdrop on his own wife while she was in labour. The official record says, "Which thing doth not befit a man?" He was fined for trying to hear what was happening during his wife's childbirth. Let that settle in your mind. A husband could not even listen to his wife giving birth. Because the birthing chamber was women's space, absolutely and completely. It was one of the few places in medieval society where women held total authority and men had no power at all. Tonight, we are going to enter that sacred space. We are going to witness what happened in those candlelit rooms where women gathered around other women, where knowledge passed from experienced hands to younger ones, where life emerged from darkness into light, and where death was always waiting just outside the door. The woman in labour is named Catherine. She is 24 years old and this is her third child. Her first birth went well. Her second child died 3 days after birth, though Catherine survived. Tonight she is frightened but also determined. She sent word to the midwife hours ago, as soon as her pains began coming regularly. The midwife is a woman named Marjorie, aged perhaps 50, Though exact ages are hard to determine in an era without consistent birth records, Marjorie has attended more than 200 births in her lifetime. She learned the craft from her mother, who learned from her mother, stretching back through generations. Marjorie cannot read or write, but she carries in her mind an encyclopedia of knowledge about women's bodies, about the stages of labour, about what is normal and what is dangerous, about when to act and when to wait. Marjorie arrives at Catherine's home carrying a leather bag with her tools and supplies. But she does not arrive alone. She brings with her 2 other women, experienced mothers who have been through childbirth themselves and who have assisted Marjorie before. And within an hour, 4 more women from the neighbourhood have arrived. Catherine's sister is there, her neighbour, 2 friends from the church. By the time labour is truly established, there are 7 women in that room. 7 is not an accident. Medieval people believed 7 was a sacred number, and having 7 women present at a birth was considered auspicious. But it also had a practical purpose. Childbirth could last for many hours, sometimes days. Having multiple women meant they could take turns supporting the labouring mother, could rest when needed, could share the physical work of helping her through each contraction. And here is what the historical record tells us. Male doctors, even when they existed, were almost never present at normal births. There were a few exceptions. If something went catastrophically wrong, if the mother was dying and the baby needed to be removed to be baptized before it died, then sometimes a male physician might be called. But that was a last resort. Childbirth was women's business, handled by women in a space that excluded men entirely. Think about what this means. In a society that gave women very little official power, very little legal authority, very few spaces where they could operate independently of male control, childbirth was different. In that room, women were the experts. Women made the decisions. Women held the knowledge. A king's wife and a peasant's wife were both attended by midwives, both surrounded by other women, both in a space where male authority stopped at the door. Catherine's labour intensifies as the night wears on. She walks around the room, supported on either side by women who murmur encouragement. Medieval midwives knew that walking and movement could help labour progress. They knew different positions for birthing. Some women gave birth on birthing stools, which were U-shaped chairs that allowed the woman to squat while being supported. Some gave birth kneeling, held from behind by another woman. Some gave birth standing, gripping a rope suspended from the ceiling beam. The idea of lying flat on your back, which became standard in later centuries, was actually rare in medieval births. Gravity was understood to be helpful, even if they did not use that word. Marjorie checks Catherine's progress periodically, using her hands with the gentle expertise born of decades of experience. She feels the position of the baby, estimates how much longer labour will take. Medieval midwives could not see inside the womb, obviously, but they developed remarkable skill at understanding what was happening through touch alone. The room is warm, almost stifling. A fire burns in the hearth, not just for warmth, but because medieval people believed that heat helped labour progress. They were not entirely wrong. Warmth does help muscles relax. The windows are shuttered tightly. Privacy was paramount. What happened in the birthing chamber stayed in the birthing chamber. And what happened there was more than just the physical process of birth. The women pray together. They recite specific prayers that have been used for generations. They invoke female saints, particularly Saint Margaret of Antioch, who was the patron saint of childbirth. According to legend, Saint Margaret was swallowed by a dragon and then burst forth from its belly unharmed. Can you see the symbolism? The baby emerging from the womb like the saint emerging from the dragon. Medieval people loved these parallel meanings. They also use objects believed to have protective power. Catherine wears a birthing girdle, which is a long strip of parchment or cloth covered with prayers and images. This girdle might be 3 meters long, about 10 feet, and it would be wrapped around her body, positioned over her womb. Recent scientific analysis of surviving birthing girdles has found something remarkable: traces of honey, milk, and other organic materials. These girdles were actually used, not just decorative. Women handled them, held them, trusted them. One birthing girdle that survived, it is now in the Wellcome collection in London, has fingerprints embedded in it. Think about that. Fingerprints from women who held this object during their most vulnerable moments, more than 500 years ago. Women whose names we will never know, whose faces we will never see, but whose fear and hope and determination left literal marks that we can still see today. Catherine also has an eagle stone, suspended around her neck. This is a hollow stone that contains smaller stones inside, so it rattles when you shake it. Medieval people believed that just as the small stones were contained within the larger stone, the baby was contained within the mother. Wearing the eagle stone would help the baby emerge safely. Does it sound superstitious? Absolutely. Did it work? Probably not in any physical sense. But did it help Catherine feel less afraid? Did it give her something to focus on, something to believe in? Almost certainly yes. And here is something that modern medicine is finally beginning to understand. The psychological state of a labouring woman actually affects the physical process of birth. Fear and stress can slow labour, can make contractions less effective, can even stop labour entirely. Anything that helped a medieval woman feel calmer, safer, more supported, even if it was just a prayer or an amulet, potentially had real medical value. But the medieval midwife's toolkit was not all prayers and sacred objects. They also had practical interventions. Marjorie has brought specific herbs with her. She has mugwort, which we talked about in the last part, believed to ease labour. She has preparations made from rose petals, which the famous medieval healer Hildegard von Bingen recommended for women in childbirth. She has strong wine mixed with certain herbs that can dull pain if the labour becomes too intense. And yes, medieval midwives had access to serious pain medication. Opium poppies grew in Europe. Midwives could make preparations from poppy seeds and juice that would genuinely reduce pain. There were also mixtures called dwale, a sleep draught made from opium, hemlock, henbane and wine that could put someone into a deep sleep. This was dangerous because the dosage was unpredictable and you could easily kill someone. But in desperate situations, when labour had gone on for days and the mother was exhausted beyond endurance, sometimes it was used. The fact that medieval midwives advocated for pain relief is actually quite progressive. Because there was a theological debate about whether women should be given pain relief in childbirth, some church authorities argued that birth pain was God's punishment for Eve's sin, and therefore women should suffer. The Bible says, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children," and some took that to mean pain was mandatory, even virtuous. But midwives, practical women who had seen real suffering, disagreed, and so did some medical writers. The Trotula, that medical text written or compiled by women in Salerno, explicitly recommends pain relief. It says that relieving a labouring woman's pain is compassionate and appropriate. This was revolutionary thinking in an era when suffering was often seen as spiritually beneficial. As Catherine's labour reaches its climax, the women gather closer. Marjorie kneels in front of her, ready to receive the baby. 2 women support Catherine from behind under her arms. Another woman holds her hand. They are all talking to her, encouraging her, telling her she is strong, she can do this, the baby is almost here. And then, in a rush of fluid and blood and extraordinary effort, the baby is born. It is a girl. Marjorie catches her expertly, checks quickly that the cord is not around the neck, turns the baby to let fluid drain from her nose and mouth. The baby gasps, coughs, and then lets out a cry. That cry is the sound everyone has been waiting for. It means the baby is alive, is breathing, has survived the dangerous passage from womb to world. The women erupt in prayers of thanksgiving. Someone runs to tell the men waiting outside that mother and baby are both alive. This is one of the few pieces of information that is allowed to pass from the women's space to the men's world. Catherine is weeping with relief and exhaustion and joy. The baby is placed on her chest, still attached by the umbilical cord, which is pulsing with the last transfers of blood and oxygen. But Marjorie's work is not done. She must now deliver the placenta, which can be dangerous. If the placenta does not come out completely, if pieces remain inside, infection can set in and kill the mother within days. Medieval midwives understood this danger intimately. They knew to wait for the placenta, to help it along gently if needed, to inspect it carefully to make sure it was whole and complete. Once the placenta is delivered, Marjorie performs a ritual that might seem strange but had serious medical purpose. She carefully inspects the placenta, looking at its colour, its texture, its completeness. She is checking for signs of disease or abnormality. Then she burns it in the fire. Why? Partly because medieval people did not want any part of the birth to be used in witchcraft or evil magic. There were superstitions about placentas being stolen for dark purposes, but also because burning it was a hygienic disposal method that prevented disease. Now comes the care of the baby. The cord is tied off and cut, usually with a clean knife, though some midwives use specific tools. The cut end is dressed with herbs, believed to prevent infection. Then the baby is washed, gently but thoroughly. Medieval people were more concerned with cleanliness than we often give them credit for. And here is where some practices that seem bizarre to us had actual purposes. The baby might be rubbed with salt, which sounds harsh but actually has mild antiseptic properties. Herbs would be used to make the baby sneeze, which helped clear any remaining fluid from the lungs. Vinegar might be rubbed on the baby's tongue, which medieval people believed would help ensure the child would speak clearly. Does vinegar actually affect speech development? No, but it does stimulate the baby's senses and responses, which was probably reassuring to the attendants. The baby is then swaddled, wrapped tightly in long strips of cloth. Medieval people believed swaddling helped the baby's limbs grow straight. Modern research actually shows that swaddling can help newborns feel secure and sleep better, so they were not completely wrong. Catherine, meanwhile, is being cared for by the other women. They clean her, change the bloody linens, help her into a clean shift. They give her a special drink, often wine mixed with herbs and spices, that is believed to help her recover strength. They settle her into bed with the baby, showing her how to position the infant for nursing. And here is something beautiful. These women will not leave her alone. For the next several days, at least one woman will always be with Catherine. This is the lying-in period, when a new mother is expected to rest and recover while other women handle all the household work. Her meals will be cooked by other women. Her older children will be watched by other women. Her chores will be done by other women. This is communal care at its most essential. The mortality statistics for medieval childbirth are horrifying by modern standards. Somewhere between 30 and 60% of women who gave birth might die from complications: hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labour. 1 in 3 women died during their childbearing years. Childbirth was genuinely the most dangerous thing most women would ever do. But here is what is remarkable. Despite those terrifying odds, despite the lack of antibiotics or surgical interventions or blood transfusions or any of the tools modern medicine relies on, most women survived. Most babies survived. And they survived because of the skill and knowledge of midwives like Marjorie, and the support of communities of women who gathered in the darkness to bring new life into the world. There were documented midwives whose reputations were extraordinary. A woman named Bourgot Loblière served as midwife to the Queen of France in the 15th century. Her position was prestigious and well paid. Another midwife named Asseline Alexandre attended the births of the Duchess of Burgundy's children in the 1370s. These women were recognized professionals, respected for their expertise. But for every famous midwife, there were thousands whose names were never recorded. Women in every village, every town, every neighborhood. Women who answered the call in the middle of the night, who brought their experience and their steady hands and their knowledge passed down through generations. Women who saved lives and lost some despite their best efforts. Women who held the hands of terrified young mothers and whispered, I know, but you can do this." As the night finally gives way to dawn, Catherine sleeps with her daughter in her arms. The women who attended the birth are cleaning up, tidying the room, banking the fire. Marjorie packs her bag, prepares to leave, though she will return later today to check on mother and baby. She is exhausted. She's been awake all night, has used all her sullen strength to bring this baby safely into the world. Does she receive a large payment? Probably not. Midwives were often paid in goods rather than money. A chicken, some eggs, bolt of cloth, help at harvest time. Sometimes they were paid by the town or parish to ensure they would attend poor women who could not pay. The compensation did not match the immense value of the work. But Marjorie goes home knowing that tonight, because of her and the women who worked with her, a mother lived and a baby lived. That is a kind of wealth that cannot be measured in coins. The birthing chamber is empty now except for Catherine and her daughter. Sunlight begins to filter through the shutters. The secret space of women's work has completed its purpose once again, and the knowledge that made it possible, the knowledge of bodies and babies, of herbs and prayers, of when to wait and when to act, that knowledge continues, carried in the hands and hearts of women who will never write it down, who will never receive historical recognition, but whose work was absolutely essential to the continuation of human life. We have seen women spinning in the darkness, brewing in their cauldrons, healing with their herbs and bringing forth new life. But there was another way medieval women held power in the night, and it is one that history has tried very hard to erase. Next we are going to meet the widows, the women who had buried their husbands and found themselves in a strange paradox, more legally free than they had ever been as wives, but more vulnerable too. We are going to discover how these women operated businesses after dark, kept account books by candlelight, and created economic power in a world that said women should not have any. The widow's vigil was different from the wife's night work, and the stories there are absolutely fascinating. So stay with me as we continue our journey through medieval darkness, where women's power grew in the shadows. A candle burns in an upstairs window long after midnight. Inside, a woman sits at a wooden table covered with parchment coins and ledger books. Her husband has been dead for 8 months, and for the first time in her adult life she is legally allowed to conduct business in her own name. This is the strange paradox of medieval widowhood. A married woman in medieval England had almost no legal identity separate from her husband. She could not own property independently, she could not make contracts, she could not appear in court to represent herself. Under a legal doctrine called coverture, her legal existence was covered by her husband's. She essentially disappeared into his identity. But a widow suddenly had rights that even unmarried women did not always enjoy. She could own property, she could run a business, she could make legal decisions, she could sue and be sued in her own name. If her husband had been a guild member, she might even be allowed to continue operating his business, at least for a time. A widow had more legal freedom than she had ever experienced as a wife, but she also had more vulnerability, because while the law might recognize her rights, society did not always protect them, and so many widows did their most important business at night, when prying eyes were fewer and when the work could be done without constant male interference. Let me introduce you to Isabel. She lives in London in the year 1423. Her late husband was a cloth merchant, a member of the Merchant Adventurers Guild. They had a comfortable home, a shop on the ground floor, and a modest but real fortune in goods and currency. When he died, suddenly, of a fever that took him in less than a week, Isabel found herself in a position she had never anticipated. She was now the head of the business. At first, the male members of her husband's guild were supportive, or they seemed to be. They offered to help her manage the business. They suggested she might want to sell it to one of them for a fair price. They assured her that running a trading operation was too complex, too demanding, too unsuitable for a woman's limited capacities. Isabel smiled and thanked them for their concern, and then she ignored every word of their advice. Because here is what those men did not know. Isabel had been doing the accounts for her husband's business for years. She had been the one tracking inventory, recording sales, managing payments. Her husband had been the public face, the one who travelled to markets and negotiated contracts. But Isabel had been the operations brain, keeping track of every transaction, every debt owed, every shipment expected. She just had to do it quietly, as married women did. She could not sign documents or appear in official records. All the credit went to her husband, but she had been running the business all along. Now she simply had to do it openly. Well, not entirely openly, because even as a widow with legal rights, Isabel faces obstacles. Male merchants do not take her seriously. Male traders try to cheat her, assuming she will not notice discrepancies. Male competitors spread rumours about the quality of her goods or her business practices. The guild, while technically allowing her to continue her husband's membership, makes it clear they expect her either to fail or to remarry soon. So Isabel adapts, and much of her adaptation involves working at night. Look at her now, sitting at her table well past midnight. She has spent the evening at the shop during normal business hours, serving customers, accepting payments, projecting the competent but not too confident demeanour that society expects from a widow. She defers to male customers' opinions. She does not argue or assert herself too forcefully. But now, in the privacy of night, she does her real work. She reviews her accounts with meticulous attention. She notices that a supplier has been shortchanging her on every shipment, giving her slightly less cloth than invoiced, and pocketing the difference. He thinks she will not notice or will not understand the calculations. He is wrong on both counts. She drafts a letter. She can write, which is unusual for women of her class but not unheard of, to a merchant in Bruges with whom her husband used to trade. She is careful with her wording. She must be professional and knowledgeable, but cannot appear too assertive or she will be dismissed as unmannerly. It is a delicate balance. The letter took her 2 hours to compose because every word must be exactly right. She counts her coins and makes careful notes about where every penny is allocated. She has bills to pay, inventory to purchase, wages to cover for the 2 apprentices who work in the shop. She has debts to collect from customers who have been slow to pay. And she knows that collecting from male customers will be even harder now that she is a widow, because they will assume she is too timid or too ignorant to pursue what is owed. Do you see the mental load she is carrying? During the day she must perform acceptable widowhood, mourning, modesty, deference, but at night she must be a ruthless businesswoman, tracking every transaction, planning every move, protecting her assets from people who would happily cheat her or push her out of the market entirely. And Isabel is not alone. Poll tax records from late 14th century England, these are tax documents that list occupations, show numerous widows operating businesses independently. There were widow brewers, widow shopkeepers, widow textile merchants, widow innkeepers. Some of these women ran small operations barely scraping by, but others were genuinely prosperous, paying substantial taxes that indicated real wealth. In the silk trade of London that we talked about earlier, some of the most successful operators were widows. They had learned the trade from their husbands or had been practitioners themselves, and when their husbands died, they continued the business. They trained apprentices, fulfilled commissions, traded goods, and they did much of this work at night, when they could focus without interruption. Why night specifically? Several reasons. First, as we have seen again and again, daytime was filled with other obligations. Even a wealthy widow had household management duties, might have children to care for, had social and religious obligations. Night was when she could focus exclusively on business. Second, doing business at night offered some protection from interference. If male competitors or guild officials did not see exactly how much business you were conducting, they were less likely to object or try to restrict you. Operating partly in shadow meant operating with slightly more freedom. Third, and this is darker, night offered some protection from harassment. A widow operating a business was sometimes seen as sexually available, the logic being that without a husband's protection, she was fair game. Working behind locked doors at night meant fewer unwanted visits, fewer inappropriate propositions, fewer dangerous situations. Let me tell you about a specific documented case that illustrates both the opportunities and dangers of widow entrepreneurship. In Oxford in the 1380s, there were records of a widow who continued her husband's brewing operation. She appeared in court documents multiple times, sometimes as plaintiff, sometimes as defendant, which tells us she was actively engaged in legal and economic affairs. In one case, she sued a male customer who refused to pay for ale he'd purchased. The court records show that she had to prove not only that he had received the ale, but that her measurements were accurate and her prices fair. Male merchants were rarely subjected to this level of scrutiny, but she won her case, which suggests she kept meticulous records and could defend her business practices. In another case, a male brewer sued her, claiming she was using unfair practices to undercut his prices. The accusation was probably baseless. More likely he resented her success, but she had to defend herself in court, had to provide evidence of her costs and pricing structure, had to prove she was not cheating. Again, she prevailed. But imagine the stress, the time, the expense of these constant legal battles, simply because she was a woman operating in a man's world. Some widows formed strategic alliances with other widows. In York, there are records of 2 widow brewers who shared equipment and resources, essentially creating a cooperative business. They split costs, shared information about suppliers, warned each other about customers who did not pay. This kind of female business network was informal and largely invisible to official records, but it was crucial for survival. Other widows found male allies, perhaps a brother, a grown son, or a trusted male friend, who would act as a frontman when necessary. The widow would make the decisions and do the work, but the man would sign documents or appear in court or negotiate with other male merchants. This was pragmatic rather than ideal, but it allowed widows to operate more freely than they otherwise could. Now, I want to shift our focus to a different kind of widow's night work. Not all widows were merchants or artisans. Many were simply poor women trying to survive, and for these women night work often meant piecework, taking in sewing, doing laundry, carding wool, any task that could be done at home and paid by the piece rather than by the day. Imagine Agnes, a widow in her 40s living in a small cottage on the edge of a village in Cambridgeshire. Her husband was a labourer who died in an accident, leaving her with 2 young children and no income. She is too old to remarry easily, even if she wanted to. Her options are limited. During the day, Agnes might work in the fields during harvest season, though she will be paid less than male workers. She might take in washing, though that pays very little. She keeps a small kitchen garden and raises a few chickens. But none of this is enough to feed 3 people through the winter. So at night, by the light of a carefully hoarded candle, Agnes spins wool. A merchant in the nearest town provides her with raw wool and pays her by the ounce for finished thread. The pay is terrible. She must spin for hours to earn what a day labourer would make in a single hour. But it is something, and she can do it at home while her children sleep, without having to pay someone to watch them. Agnes is not building a business empire. She is not accumulating wealth. She is simply trying to keep her children alive until they are old enough to work themselves. This is the reality for countless medieval widows. Night work was not an opportunity but a desperate necessity. The mortality rates for widows were concerning. Historical records suggest that widows, particularly poor widows, died at higher rates than married women of the same age. Why? Malnutrition, overwork, exposure to cold and disease, stress. A widow without family support or economic resources was in genuine danger. But here is something that might surprise you. Widows also had one significant advantage. They could not be beaten by a husband. Medieval law allowed husbands to correct their wives with physical punishment. A widow was free from that particular danger. I am not saying widowhood was preferable. Most women would have chosen to keep their husbands alive if they could. But the absence of domestic violence was not nothing. Some widows found unexpected paths to power and influence. If a widow was the mother of an heir, particularly if that heir was still a child, she might serve as guardian and administrator of his estates until he came of age. This gave her temporary control over substantial resources and property. There are cases of noble widows who essentially ruled estates for decades. They managed agricultural operations, made legal decisions, negotiated marriages for their children, corresponded with other nobles and even with royalty. These women developed real political and economic expertise. They were in effect running small kingdoms. And much of this work happened at night, because during the day there were public duties, ceremonial obligations, people constantly requesting audiences and favours. Night was when an administrative widow could review estate accounts, draft important letters, make strategic decisions. Night was when real power was exercised. Let me share one more story, this one from the wills and testaments that survive from medieval England. A man named Thomas Farnham died in the year 1499 in Cambridgeshire. His will names his wife Catherine as one of the executors of his estate, along with his sons William and Richard. This means Catherine had legal authority to settle her husband's affairs, distribute his assets, pay his debts, manage his bequests. The will is quite specific about what Catherine receives: the beds and all the domestic utensils not already bequeathed. This might not sound like much, but think about what it means. Catherine gets the beds, plural, suggesting a household with multiple rooms and some wealth. She gets all the domestic utensils, the cooking pots, the dishes, the tools for running a household. She gets the things that allow her to continue living independently. Her sons get the middle-sized cupboards. Her daughters get lamps. These are careful, specific divisions of property. And Catherine, as executor, has the power to ensure they are carried out properly. She has legal authority that many married women never had. Did Catherine sit up at night, as Isabel did, working through documents and making decisions? Almost certainly. Did she face resistance from male relatives or neighbours who thought a woman should not be handling these matters? Probably. Did she persist anyway? The historical record suggests yes. As the candle burns lower in Isabel's window, she finally sets down her quill and rubs her tired eyes. She has been working for nearly 4 hours. Her accounts are balanced. Her letters are written. Her business plans are updated. She knows exactly where she stands financially, knows what she needs to do to survive until spring, knows which customers to pursue and which suppliers to drop. In the morning, she will put on her widow's veil and her modest demeanour. She will go to her shop and conduct business with appropriate humility. She will let male customers think they are in charge of transactions that she is actually controlling completely. She will smile and nod and appear grateful for advice she does not need. But tonight, in this quiet hour, she knows the truth. She is running a successful business, she is supporting herself and maintaining her independence. She is using her intelligence and her skills in ways that society says women should not be able to do. The widow's vigil is different from other forms of women's night work we have explored. The spinner creates thread, the brewer creates ale, the healer creates remedies, the midwife helps create life itself, but the widow creates something perhaps even more radical in medieval society: economic independence. And that kind of power, that kind of freedom, terrified the patriarchal establishment more than almost anything else. But widows were not the only women finding power in darkness. There was another night activity that shaped medieval women's lives profoundly, one that connected them directly to the divine, to the sacred, to realms beyond the physical world. In just a moment, we are going to explore the spiritual lives of medieval women, the prayers said in darkness, the vigils kept through the night, the direct relationships with God that women cultivated when the world was asleep. We are going to discover that in seeking heaven, medieval women found a different kind of earthly power, one that even the most patriarchal institutions had to grudgingly respect. So stay with me as we move from the counting house to the chapel, from earthly accounts to heavenly ones. A bell rings in the darkness. Once, twice, 3 times. It is 2 o'clock in the morning, and across medieval Europe, women are waking. Some are nuns in convents rising for the night office called matins. Others are noble women in manor houses reaching for their personal prayer books. Still others are peasant wives pausing in their night work to whisper prayers they learned from their mothers. The night belongs to God, they have been taught, and women, more than men, are expected to keep vigil in the hours when demons supposedly prowl, and salvation feels both nearest and most desperately needed. Tonight, we are going to explore a dimension of medieval women's lives that might seem distant from the practical work of spinning and brewing and healing. But religious devotion was not separate from women's night lives. It was woven through everything they did. Prayer was power. Holiness was currency. And the hours between midnight and dawn were considered the most spiritually potent of all. Let us begin in a Benedictine convent in Yorkshire, in the year 1360. The dormitory is cold, stone walls hold the chill of the autumn night. When the bell rings for matins, 30 nuns rise from their narrow beds. They are already dressed, more or less. Medieval people often slept in their undergarments, so rising for prayer just meant adding an outer robe and shoes. The nuns process silently through dark corridors to the chapel. Each woman knows the path by heart, could walk it blindfolded. They have done this every night for years, sometimes decades. The youngest nun here is 15, the oldest is nearly 70. They have been keeping this schedule, waking multiple times per night for prayer, for their entire adult lives. Think about that for a moment. What would it do to your body, to your mind, to wake at 2 in the morning every single morning for 40 years? Medieval nuns were chronically sleep-deprived as a matter of religious duty. They went to bed around 8 or 9 in the evening, slept for perhaps 4 or 5 hours, woke for matins, returned to bed for another hour or 2, then rose again at dawn for lauds. Their sleep was fractured, interrupted, never quite sufficient. Why did they do this? The theological reasoning was clear. Jesus had suffered on the cross. The saints had endured martyrdom. If religious women wanted to follow in Christ's footsteps, they must embrace suffering too. Interrupted sleep was a form of mortification of the flesh, a way of demonstrating devotion through bodily discipline. But there was more to it than just suffering. The night hours were considered especially holy. In the Bible, Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane at night. The resurrection happens at dawn, emerging from night. Monastic tradition held that demons were most active in darkness, and therefore the faithful needed to be awake, praying, pushing back against evil with their voices raised in hymns and psalms. In the chapel, candles have already been lit by whichever nun had been assigned that week's duty. The light flickers against stone walls and illuminated manuscripts. Each nun takes her place in the choir stalls, specific seats assigned by seniority and rank. The abbess has her own seat slightly elevated. The prioress, the cellarer, the sacristan, each has her designated place. And then they sing. If you've never heard medieval plain chant, it is difficult to describe. The voices are unaccompanied, moving in unison through melodies that are both ancient and timeless. There is something about human voices in a stone space in the middle of the night that creates a particular quality of sound, resonant, ethereal, otherworldly. The nuns are exhausted, but their voices are trained. They know these psalms by heart. They have sung them thousands of times. The office of matins can last anywhere from 1 to 2 hours, depending on the feast day and the particular monastic rule being followed. That is 1 to 2 hours of standing, singing, praying in the cold and dark. Then the nuns return to bed for a brief sleep before Lauds at dawn. Do you find this moving or horrifying? Maybe both. There is something beautiful about this dedication, this regularity, this sense of purpose. But there is also something harsh, something that seems to disregard the basic human need for rest and warmth and comfort. Medieval people would not have seen it that way, though. For them, the body was less important than the soul. Earthly comfort was temporary. Heavenly reward was eternal. If you could earn salvation through prayer and self-denial, was it not worth any amount of earthly discomfort? But let us step outside the convent walls now, because not all women's nighttime devotion happened in religious houses. In fact, the majority of women were not nuns. They were lay women, married or single, living in the world, and yet they too were expected to pray at night. Meet Cecily, a merchant's wife in Norwich in the year 1400. Cecily is not a nun and has no intention of becoming one. She has a husband, 3 living children, and 2 who died in infancy. She runs her household, helps with her husband's business, manages servants. Her days are busy and exhausting. But Cecily also owns a book of hours. This is a personal prayer book, smaller than the large manuscripts used in churches, designed to be held in the hands during private devotion. Books of hours were extraordinarily popular among wealthy and middle-class women in the late medieval period. They were illuminated, decorated with gold leaf and colourful paintings, and they were treasured possessions, sometimes the most valuable thing a woman owned besides her jewellery. Cecily's Book of Hours contains prayers for each of the canonical hours, the same prayer schedule that nuns follow, but adapted for lay people. It includes psalms, prayers to the Virgin Mary, prayers to various saints, a calendar of feast days, and sometimes personal additions like prayers for deceased family members. Every night, after the household has settled and her husband has fallen asleep, Cecily rises quietly. She wraps herself in a warm cloak, lights a candle, and opens her Book of Hours. She might not pray for 2 full hours like the nuns do, but she prays for 30 minutes, perhaps an hour. She reads, or if she cannot read well, she recites from memory, the prayers for Compline and Matins. She meditates on the illuminated images of the Virgin Mary, of Christ on the cross, of saints suffering their martyrdom. Why does she do this? Partly from genuine devotion. Medieval Christianity was not just a Sunday activity, it was woven into every aspect of life. People believed with absolute conviction in heaven and hell, in the reality of sin and salvation, in the power of prayer to affect outcomes both in this world and the next. But Cecily's nighttime prayers also have specific purposes. She prays for her children's health. Child mortality is so high that every parent lives in constant fear. She prays for her husband's safe return when he travels on business. She prays for the souls of her 2 babies who died, hoping her prayers will shorten their time in purgatory. She prays for a successful pregnancy. She is pregnant again, and childbirth terrifies her for good reason. These prayers are not passive. Medieval people believed that prayer could actively change outcomes. A saint's intercession, earned through proper devotion, could heal illness, protect travelers, ease childbirth, save souls. Prayer was work, spiritual work that had tangible effects. And here is something fascinating. Women's prayers were considered especially powerful in certain contexts. The Virgin Mary was, after all, the most important intercessor between humanity and God. She was a woman. Women praying to Mary, woman to woman, were thought to have a special connection, a special claim on her mercy. There are documented cases of women forming prayer networks. A group of women might agree to pray for each other's intentions, creating a kind of spiritual support system. If one woman's child was sick, the others would add prayers for that child to their nightly devotions. If one woman's husband was traveling, prayers for his safety. If one woman died, prayers for her soul. These networks were informal, undocumented. No one wrote down the agreements or kept records. But they were real and they were important. They created bonds between women that existed outside of male supervision or control. Now, let me tell you about a specific woman whose religious devotion in the night became famous, or rather, infamous. Her name was Marjorie Kempe, and she lived in the early 1500s in England. Marjorie was not a nun. She was a married woman, a mother of 14 children, a former businesswoman who had tried brewing and milling and failed at both. But Marjorie had religious visions. She heard Christ speaking to her. She wept uncontrollably during religious services, loud sobbing that disrupted masses and annoyed her fellow worshippers. She wore white clothing like a virgin even though she was married, claiming that she and her husband had taken vows of chastity, though her husband's account of this arrangement suggests he was less enthusiastic than she was. And Marjorie prayed constantly, including through the night. She described lying awake for hours, conversing mentally with Christ, with the Virgin Mary, with various saints. She went on pilgrimages, travelled to Jerusalem, to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela. She was a mystic, a holy woman, a religious celebrity of sorts. She was also deeply controversial. Many people thought she was a fraud, a hysteric, possibly possessed by demons rather than inspired by God. Church authorities investigated her multiple times for heresy. She was arrested, questioned, threatened. But she always managed to defend herself, to convince the authorities that her visions were genuine, that her devotion was real. Marjorie eventually dictated her autobiography. She could not write, but she had scribes write down her story. The Book of Marjorie Kempe is one of the very few autobiographical texts by a medieval woman that survives, and it gives us an extraordinary window into one woman's nighttime spiritual life. Whether you believe Marjorie's visions were genuine divine communication or symptoms of some kind of psychological condition, her story tells us something important. Religious devotion gave medieval women a kind of authority they could not get any other way. If God spoke to you directly, even the most powerful man had to at least consider that you might be right. There were other famous medieval mystics: Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Catherine of Siena. These women had visions, wrote theological texts, advised popes and kings, shaped religious practice. They were able to do this because their authority came from God, not from any earthly institution. And their most intense spiritual experiences often happened at night, in darkness, in solitude. Julian of Norwich, for example, described receiving a series of visions of Christ's passion over the course of one night in May of 1373. She was 30 years old and seriously ill, possibly dying. In her fevered state, she saw Christ on the cross speaking to her, showing her the meaning of divine love. She survived her illness and spent the rest of her life, she lived to be at least 70, as an anchoress, a woman walled up in a tiny cell attached to a church, devoting herself entirely to prayer and contemplation. Julian's visions became a book called Revelations of Divine Love, one of the first books in English written by a woman. And what did she write about? God's love, God's maternal love even. She described Christ as a mother who nurses and nurtures humanity. This was radical theology, this idea that God could be understood through feminine imagery. And Julian came to these ideas through nighttime visions, through hours spent in darkness and silence, communing with what she believed was the divine. But we must also talk about the darker side of women's nighttime religious practice, the suspicion it generated, the danger it carried, because a woman alone at night, even if she was praying, was vulnerable to accusation. What was she really doing in those dark hours? Was she truly praying to God, or was she perhaps invoking demons? Was she a holy woman or a witch? The line was terrifyingly thin. The same behaviour that could make a woman a saint if people believed her could make her a heretic if they did not. Marjorie Kemper narrowly avoided being burned several times. Other women were not so lucky. There are documented cases from the later medieval period and early modern period of women being accused of witchcraft partly because they were seen praying or performing rituals at night. The very devotion that was supposed to protect them instead became evidence against them. Let us return to Cecily in Norwich with her Book of Hours. She finishes her prayers, closes the book carefully, extinguishes her candle. The house is silent except for her husband snoring. Her children sleep in the next room. Outside, the night is dark and cold and possibly dangerous. But here, in this quiet moment, Cecily feels connected to something larger than herself. She prays for her family because she loves them and fears for them. She prays for her own soul because she fears hell and hopes for heaven. She prays because it gives structure to her anxiety, a channel for her fear. She prays because every woman she knows prays, and the shared ritual creates community, even when each woman prays alone. Before she returns to bed, Cecily goes to check on her children. This is part of her nighttime routine. She adjusts the blankets over the oldest girl, touches the forehead of her youngest son to check for fever. He has been coughing. She whispers a prayer over each child, not a formal Latin prayer from her book, but something simpler, in English, something her own mother taught her. God protect you through the dark. Mary keep you safe till morning. Angels guard your sleeping. Amen. It is not great theology. No church father would include it in a manuscript. But it is real and it is powerful in its own way. It is a mother's love expressed through the language of faith. The night is not yet over. In a few hours dawn will come and the day's work will begin. But for now, in these dark hours, women across medieval Europe are keeping vigil, some in convents, some in manor houses, some in tiny cottages, some with elaborate prayer books, some with just memorized words, some seeking visions of God, some just seeking protection from the dangers of the world. They are praying for healing, for safety, for children, for husbands, for the dead, for themselves. They are creating connections to the divine, to each other, to the generations of women who prayed before them and who will pray after them. Religious devotion in the night was not separate from women's other night work, it was interwoven with it. The spinner might pray as she spun. The widow might pray as she tallied her accounts. The midwife certainly prayed as she attended a difficult birth. The alewife might whisper a prayer over her fermenting brew. The sacred and the practical were not divided in medieval life the way we divide them now. Everything was potentially sacred. Every action could be an offering to God. The night was a time when the veil between heaven and earth seemed thinner, when prayer felt more likely to be heard, when divine intervention seemed almost within reach. And yet, we must acknowledge, all this devotion, all these prayers, all these interrupted nights and cold chapels and hours on your knees, did it actually help? Did it change anything? Medieval people believed absolutely that it did. Modern people might be more skeptical, but perhaps that is the wrong question. Perhaps the help came not from divine intervention, but from the ritual itself, from the sense of control it provided in an uncontrollable world, from the community it created, from the meaning it gave to suffering. If a woman watching her child die of fever could do nothing medically to help, at least she could pray. And that prayer gave her agency, gave her something to do besides despair. The bell rings again, calling the nuns back to prayer. Cecily returns to her bed. Marjorie Kempe lies awake, tears running down her face, conversing with her God. And across the medieval landscape in darkness punctuated only by candle flames and stars, women keep their vigils. They have kept them for centuries. They will keep them for centuries more, until the world changes so drastically that these rhythms of prayer and sleep and prayer again will seem almost incomprehensible to future generations. But for now, in this medieval night, the sacred darkness holds them all. And in just a moment we are going to shift from the sacred back to the profane, from chapel to marketplace. Because while some women were praying in the night, others were trading, selling, hustling in shadow markets that operated after dark. We are going to discover the night traders, the women who peddled eggs and cheese and ale and secrets, who created informal economies that men barely knew existed, who turned the darkness into opportunity rather than danger. So come with me now as we follow the night traders into the sleeping streets, where commerce never truly stopped, and women found yet another way to survive. The streets should be empty. Curfew was hours ago. The city gates are locked. Night watchmen patrol with their lanterns looking for anyone breaking the law. And yet, if you know where to look, if you know the right alleyways and hidden courtyards, you will find commerce still happening. Whispered transactions, quick exchanges of coins for goods, women selling eggs and cheese and second-hand clothing and information. This is the shadow economy of medieval cities, and it belongs almost entirely to women. Welcome to a world that official records barely document, that laws try to suppress, that men mostly ignore because they do not understand its importance. Welcome to the world of the night traders. It is 3 o'clock in the morning in London, sometime around the year 1460. Most of the city sleeps, but in a small courtyard behind the church of St. Mary le Bow, there is activity. 6 women have gathered, seemingly by chance but actually by careful arrangement. They stand in the shadows, speaking quietly, their voices barely rising above whispers. One woman has a basket of eggs. Another has a wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth. A third has bundles of dried herbs, medicinal plants that she gathered herself. A fourth has used clothing that she has mended and cleaned. A fifth has fresh bread that she baked just hours ago. And the sixth has something more valuable than any physical good. She has information. These women are hucksters, a term that originally just meant small-scale sellers, though it would eventually take on negative connotations. They are women operating at the absolute margins of the medieval economy, selling goods that are not quite legal, not quite illegal, but definitely operating outside official channels. Why meet at 3 in the morning? Why not conduct business during the day in the regular markets? Several reasons, and they tell us everything about how difficult it was for poor women to make a living in medieval cities. First, official market spaces cost money. If you wanted a stall in the regular market, you had to pay fees to the city or to the guild that controlled that market. These fees were beyond the reach of the poorest sellers, so they had to find alternative spaces and alternative times. Second, guild regulations restricted who could sell what. In many medieval cities, only guild members were allowed to sell certain goods. If you were a woman who was not married to a guild member or the widow of a guild member, you were shut out of official commerce entirely. So you operated unofficially, which meant operating when the guilds were not watching, which meant night. Third, and this is darker, night offered some protection from harassment and robbery. A woman selling goods alone in a busy daytime market was vulnerable. Men might steal from her. City officials might confiscate her goods for not having proper licenses. Other sellers might drive her away from good selling spots. But at night, in secret locations known only to trusted women, she had more control. And fourth, and this might surprise you, some goods commanded better prices in the shadow economy than in the official market. Because the buyers coming to these night markets were often servants from wealthy households who were buying food for their employers but skimming a bit off the top for themselves, they preferred buying from unlicensed sellers who would not ask questions or report the transactions. Let me tell you about the woman with the information, because she represents something fascinating. Her name is Bess, and her trade is what we might call intelligence gathering. She knows which merchant ships arrived at the docks today and what goods they brought. She knows which noblemen are in town and which have left. She knows which houses are hiring servants and which are letting people go. She knows where to buy the cheapest bread and which baker adulterates his flour. She knows which money lenders charge fair rates and which are thieves. How does she know all this? She listens. She walks through the city during the day, stopping to chat with other women, with servants, with apprentices, with anyone who will talk to her. She has cultivated relationships with women who work in big households, with women who sell in the regular markets, with women who do laundry and thus see the inside of many homes. She pieces together information from dozens of sources, and then she sells that information to other women who need it. One of tonight's buyers is a woman named Alice, who is looking for work as a wet nurse. Bess tells her that a merchant family 3 streets over just had a baby, and the mother's milk has not come in well. They will be looking for a wet nurse within the week. That information is worth 2 eggs to Alice, who pays gladly, because now she knows exactly where to go, exactly which door to knock on, before any other woman hears about the opportunity. Another buyer is a woman who needs to know the price of wool. She is planning to buy wool tomorrow to spin, and she needs to know whether the price is fair or inflated. Bess tells her what the wool merchants were asking at the docks this morning. Worth 1 penny. Information is currency, knowledge is power. And in medieval cities where most people could not read, where news travelled by word of mouth, where there were no newspapers or bulletin boards, women like Bess, who collected and distributed information, were providing a crucial service. Now, I want you to understand something important. This shadow economy was not criminal in the way we usually think of crime. These women were not stealing or committing fraud. They were simply selling goods and services outside the official regulated male-controlled economy. They were doing business in the spaces that the law had not bothered to regulate because men did not think women's small-scale commerce was important enough to worry about. But to the authorities, any commerce that happened outside official channels was suspicious. Any gathering of people after curfew was potentially dangerous. And any women operating independently were, well, you can probably guess by now, potentially witches or prostitutes or some other category of dangerous female. There are documented cases from medieval city records of women being arrested for night walking, which was the catch-all term for being out after dark without a good reason. Sometimes night walking was code for prostitution, but often it was just women conducting business, women going to help a neighbour, women doing the things they needed to do to survive. In 1540, we are now into the early modern period, but the pattern started earlier. The city of Chester passed a law specifically targeting young women who sold ale. The law banned women between the ages of 14 and 40 from being alewives. The stated reason was that young women were supposedly too sexually tempting and would lead men into sin. But the real reason was probably economic. Male brewers wanted to reduce competition, and young women were their most successful competitors. Let us return to our courtyard behind St Mary le Bow. The transactions are complete. The women are dispersing, each going her separate way, each carrying the goods or coins or information she came for. They move quietly through the dark streets, staying close to the walls, avoiding the main thoroughfares where watchmen patrol. One of these women, let us call her Margaret, is heading to another location where she will sell her eggs to servants who are up early preparing their masters' breakfasts. Margaret is a widow with 3 children. Her husband was a labourer who died falling from scaffolding while working on a church construction project. She receives no compensation, no widow's pension. Her options are to remarry, to become a servant herself, or to find some way to support her family independently. She chooses independence, which means she chooses hardship. Because operating in the shadow economy is precarious, she has no legal protections. If someone cheats her, she cannot go to court. If someone robs her, she cannot report it to authorities because she would have to explain why she was out after curfew. If her goods are confiscated, she has no recourse. But she also has no master. No one tells her what to do or how to do it. No one takes a percentage of her earnings. The money she makes, and it is not much, but it is something, belongs entirely to her and her children. Margaret's eldest daughter, who is 12, often comes with her on these night excursions. The girl carries a smaller basket of eggs, learns the routes through the dark city, meets the regular customers, absorbs the knowledge she will need to do this work herself someday. This is education of a sort that no school provides and no book contains. This is survival training passed from mother to daughter. They reach a large house near Cheapside. Margaret knows that the cook here wakes at 4 in the morning to start the day's work. She taps gently on the kitchen door, a specific pattern of knocks that identifies her. The door opens a crack. Coins and eggs are exchanged. A few words whispered. Then the door closes and Margaret moves on to the next house. By the time dawn breaks, Margaret will have sold all her eggs. She will have earned enough to buy bread and a bit of meat for tonight's supper. She will have set aside a few coins, copper pennies, nothing grand, toward the rent that is due next week. And then she will go home, get her younger children up and fed, and do it all again the next night. This is not a story of triumph. This is not rags to riches. This is just survival night after night, season after season. It is exhausting and precarious and offers no path to prosperity. But it is also a kind of freedom that was rare for medieval women. Now, I want to talk about a different kind of night trading, one that was more established, more lucrative and more dangerous, the trade in second-hand goods. In medieval cities, there were official second-hand markets where used clothing, tools and household items were bought and sold, but there were also unofficial markets that operated at night, and these were spaces where women dominated. Why? Because women were the ones who generally managed household goods. Women knew fabric, knew the value of a good wool cloak or a linen shift. Women were more likely to have access to used clothing and linens through their work as servants or laundresses. But the second-hand trade was tricky because it was closely associated with theft. If you bought a stolen cloak from someone at night, were you responsible for checking whether it was stolen? Medieval law said yes. You could be prosecuted for possessing stolen goods even if you had bought them innocently. And yet the second-hand trade was crucial for poor people. New clothing was expensive, remember. Every thread had to be spun by hand, every piece of fabric woven by hand, every garment sewn by hand. A new wool cloak might cost more than a labourer earned in a month, but a used cloak, even if it was patched and faded, would keep you warm through winter for a fraction of the price. Women who traded in second-hand goods walked a knife's edge between legitimate commerce and criminal activity. They had to know their suppliers, had to trust that the goods were not stolen, had to build relationships with buyers who would come back again and again. There is a wonderful account, wonderful because it is so detailed, from a church court in England in the 1400s. A woman named Joan was accused of buying stolen goods. In her defence, she explained her entire business model. She said she bought used clothing from servants who were clearing out their mistresses' wardrobes. She inspected each item carefully, asked questions about where it came from, refused to buy anything that seemed suspicious. She then cleaned and mended the clothing, which added value, and she sold it at the market, though she admits that sometimes the market was after the sun had set. The court records show that several other women testified on Joan's behalf, saying she was honest and trustworthy, that she had been doing this work for years, that everyone in the neighbourhood knew her. Joan was ultimately acquitted, but the case shows how vulnerable these women were to accusation, how their livelihoods depended on reputation, and how important the testimony of other women was in protecting them. Do you see how complicated it was? The law said women should be modest, obedient, confined to home, but economic reality said women needed to work, needed to trade, needed to hustle to survive, and the gap between those two imperatives, between what women were supposed to do and what they actually needed to do, was bridged largely at night, in shadow economies that operate outside official view. Let me tell you one more story, this one about a woman whose night trading took a very different form. Her name was Aliena, and she lived in Paris in the 1300s. Aliena sold something that was not quite legal but not quite illegal either. She sold predictions. Aliena claimed to be able to predict the future by reading stars, by interpreting dreams, by various forms of divination. Was she a fraud? Probably at least partly, but she was also providing a service that people desperately wanted. They wanted to know if their ship would come in safely, if their lawsuit would succeed, if their sick child would recover, if the person they loved would love them back. And Aliena was clever. She never promised certainty. She spoke in probabilities and possibilities. The stars suggest that. Your dream indicates that. This gave her room to be wrong without losing all credibility. And apparently she was good at reading people, at picking up on body language and tone of voice, at telling people what they wanted to hear, while leaving herself an escape route if events turned out differently. She operated at night because daytime fortune-telling would have attracted too much attention from church authorities who considered divination to be potentially heretical. But night sessions, conducted privately in her home with one client at a time, flew under the radar. Her clients were mostly women. Women worried about pregnancies, about marriages, about children, about all the things that women had very little control over but desperately wanted to predict. Was Alienor exploiting vulnerable people? Possibly. Was she also providing comfort, hope, and a sense of agency to women who had very little of either? Also possibly. The historical record does not judge her. It merely notes that she existed, that she had clients, that she earned money through her predictions. Eventually, Alienor was investigated by church authorities. Someone reported her, but by the time officials came looking for her, she had moved to a different neighbourhood, and was operating under a different name. The shadow economy had swallowed her up and protected her. As the sky begins to lighten, it is perhaps 5 o'clock now and the city is starting to wake. The night traders finish their work. They return to their homes, their tiny rented rooms, their corners in shared spaces. They count their earnings, hide their coins, prepare for the next night. They have created an entire economic system that operates in darkness, that leaves almost no records, that historians can barely document. But it was real. It supported families, it created opportunities, it gave women who had no other options a way to survive. The official economy said women should not be merchants. The official economy said women's work was worth half of men's work. The official economy shut women out of guilds, out of land ownership, out of most profitable trades. But the shadow economy said, if official channels will not have us, we will create our own channels. If the day will not make room for us, we will own the night. And they did. In the darkness, in the hidden courtyards, in the whispered exchanges, women built networks of commerce and survival that had their own rules, their own hierarchies, their own forms of trust and reciprocity. This was not the grand story of medieval commerce that history books tell. This was not the wool trade or the spice trade or the banking houses of Florence. This was small, local, intimate, and almost invisible. But it was vast in aggregate. Thousands of women in hundreds of cities every single night, engaging in the transactions that kept their families fed and housed. As we move toward the conclusion of our journey through medieval nights, there is one more dimension of women's night lives that we must explore, and it is perhaps the most charged, the most misunderstood, the most deliberately obscured by history. We are going to talk about sex, about desire, about the nights when women's bodies were supposed to belong to their husbands but sometimes belonged to themselves. We are going to enter the conjugal bedroom and discover that even there, in that most private space, women found ways to negotiate, to resist, to claim small measures of autonomy. The paradox of the conjugal night is that it was simultaneously the space where women had the least power and where they sometimes wielded the most. So stay with me as we step through one more door into the last and most intimate dimension of medieval women's secret night lives. Behind the closed door of a medieval bedroom, the rules change, or rather they become more complicated, more contradictory, more impossible to navigate. The church has very clear teachings about what should happen between husband and wife at night. Society has its expectations. The law grants husbands rights over their wives' bodies. But the reality, the messy, human, complicated reality, is something else entirely. Tonight, we're going to talk about the most private aspect of medieval women's night lives: sexuality, desire, reproduction, and the strategies women used to maintain some measure of control over their own bodies in a world that said those bodies belonged to someone else. This is sensitive territory, and I want to approach it with care. We are not going to be crude or sensational, but we are also not going to pretend that this dimension of women's lives did not exist or did not matter. Because for medieval wives, the marital bed was a space of profound paradox, simultaneously the place where they were most vulnerable and sometimes the place where they held the most power. Let us start with what the church taught, because church teaching shaped everything about medieval sexuality, at least officially. According to medieval theologians, sex had exactly one acceptable purpose: procreation within marriage. Sex for pleasure was sinful. Sex in any position other than what we now call missionary position was sinful. Sex on holy days was sinful. Sex during a woman's menstruation was sinful. Sex during pregnancy was sinful. Sex while nursing was sinful. Sex for any reason other than the deliberate intention to create a child was sinful. Do you see how narrow that window is? If you followed all the church's rules, there were perhaps 20 or 30 days per year when sex was actually permissible. And even then, it should be joyless, quick, performed purely as a duty. Now here is the thing. Very few people actually followed these rules. We know this because medieval priests were constantly complaining about it in their sermons and in confession manuals. They would not have complained so much if people had been obedient. The gap between ideal and reality was vast. But the rules still mattered because they created shame and fear. They gave husbands leverage over wives and wives leverage over husbands. They complicated what was already a complicated dynamic. Meet Anne and Robert. They have been married for 6 years. They live in a small manor house in the countryside. They are not nobles, but they are more prosperous than peasants. Robert owns land that he inherited from his father. Anne brought a modest dowry to the marriage. They have 3 living children and 1 who died in infancy. On this particular night, Robert approaches Anne with obvious intentions. She is tired, she's been working all day as always. She is also worried because she suspects she might be pregnant again, and the last pregnancy was difficult. She nearly died from bleeding after the birth. The midwife said another pregnancy too soon could be dangerous. But what can Anne say? Medieval law is clear. A husband has rights to his wife's body. Refusing sex without a good reason, and exhaustion or fear do not count as good reasons, is considered a wife's failure of duty. Some theologians even argued that a wife who refused her husband was pushing him toward the sin of adultery or worse. And yet Anne is not entirely powerless. She has strategies, and many medieval wives employed similar ones. First, she can plead illness. Not just tiredness, but actual illness. A fever, stomach pain, a headache so severe that any movement is agony. Medieval medicine believed that sex could be dangerous when someone was sick, that it could worsen illness, spread disease. A husband might be frustrated, but he would generally back down if his wife seemed genuinely unwell. Second, she can invoke religious prohibition. Is today the feast of a major saint? Is it Lent? Is it Advent? The church had an extensive calendar of days when sex was forbidden. A pious wife could remind her husband of these restrictions. He might choose to ignore them, but at least it gave her grounds to negotiate. Third, and this is more subtle, she can simply not cooperate. Medieval sex required some level of female cooperation for reasons we will discuss in a moment. A woman who lay completely still, who did not move or respond, who made the act as joyless and mechanical as possible, was exercising a form of passive resistance. But Anne does none of these things tonight. Why not? Because she needs something from Robert. She wants permission to visit her sister in the next village, and her sister's husband and Robert do not get along. Robert has forbidden the visit before, but Anne knows that if she is warm and welcoming tonight, if she makes Robert feel desired and satisfied, he will be more amenable to her request in the morning. This is transactional. This is strategic. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge. But this is also one of the few forms of power available to medieval wives. The medieval bedroom was a negotiation space. Women could not refuse outright, but they could influence, could withhold enthusiasm, could trade cooperation for small concessions. It was not consent in the way we understand it today. The entire concept of marital rape did not exist in medieval law. A husband could not rape his wife because sex was considered his legal right, but women still found ways to exercise agency within these terrible constraints. Now, let us talk about something that might surprise you. Medieval medical theory actually placed significant importance on the female sexual pleasure, not for its own sake, but because they believed conception required both partners to reach completion and produce seed. This idea came from ancient Greek medicine, particularly from Hippocrates and Galen, and it persisted throughout the medieval period. The theory was that both men and women produce seed, and conception happened when the two seeds mixed in the womb. For a woman to produce seed, she needed to experience pleasure and climax. Can you imagine what this meant for medieval sexuality? It meant that husbands who wanted children, and most did desperately because children were economic assets and heirs, had motivation to ensure their wives experienced pleasure. Medical texts from the period specifically instruct men on how to arouse their wives, how to bring them to completion. One medieval medical text called the Trotula, yes, the same compendium we discussed earlier, has an entire section on conception. It recommends that couples engage in foreplay, that the man should stimulate his wife until she is fully aroused, that both partners should reach climax for conception to occur. This is shockingly progressive for a text written nearly 1,000 years ago. Of course, the goal was still procreation, not female pleasure for its own sake. But the effect was that female sexual satisfaction was, within marriage and for purposes of conception, considered important. This gave women some bargaining power. A wife could say, or imply, that her failure to conceive was due to her husband's insufficient attention to her pleasure. She might suggest trying certain techniques, certain positions, certain approaches. Obviously, this only worked if the couple actually wanted children, and if the husband believed the medical theory. But many did. Now, let us talk about contraception and abortion, because this is where things get truly complicated and dangerous. The Church absolutely forbade any interference with conception. Using any method to prevent pregnancy was considered a serious sin, on par with murder in some theological writings. And yet, people did it anyway. Women in particular had strong motivations to limit births. Each pregnancy was a risk to her life. Each child was another mouth to feed in households that often had barely enough food. Medieval women had access to herbal contraceptives, pennyroyal, rue, Queen Anne's lace seeds. These plants were known to have anti-fertility properties. Some work by preventing ovulation, some by preventing implantation, some by causing early miscarriage. The distinction between contraception and early abortion was not clear in medieval understanding. A woman seeking to avoid pregnancy might drink pennyroyal tea regularly. She might use pessaries, substances inserted into the vagina that created hostile conditions for conception. She might use barrier methods like sea sponges soaked in various substances. There are scattered references to these methods in medical texts, usually phrased carefully to avoid outright endorsement, but clearly describing known practices. After sex, some women practice what we would call the rhythm method, trying to time intercourse to avoid fertile periods. But medieval understanding of the fertility cycle was imperfect. Some texts claimed women were most fertile during menstruation, which is exactly wrong, so this method was not reliable. There was also coitus interruptus, withdrawal before completion. Some medieval texts mention this, always disapprovingly. The sin of Onan in the Bible, who spilled his seed on the ground, was interpreted as a prohibition against this practice, but people did it anyway. And there were stranger methods that probably did not work at all, but reflect desperate attempts at control, sneezing vigorously after intercourse, jumping backwards 7 times, wearing amulets, eating specific foods, avoiding others. These were folk remedies passed from woman to woman, some effective, many not. Here is the crucial thing: women could not openly seek or discuss these methods. Asking a midwife or wise woman for contraceptive help had to be done in whispers, in code. Something to regulate my courses, something for women's troubles. The wise woman would understand and would provide the herbs or advice, but it was always risky. If word got out that a woman was deliberately preventing pregnancy, she could be accused of witchcraft, of interfering with God's plan, of sinning against nature. Some women sought outright abortion when pregnancy occurred, despite their efforts to prevent it. This was even more dangerous. The herbs that could induce abortion, pennyroyal in high doses, tansy savin, were poison. The line between an effective dose and a lethal dose was thin. Women died trying to end pregnancies, and if a woman survived the physical danger, there was still moral and legal danger. Abortion was considered murder by the church once the fetus was quickened, once the woman could feel it moving, usually around 4 or 5 months. Before quickening, the moral status was murkier, but it was still sinful. Why did women take these risks? Because the alternative, bearing child after child, potentially dying in childbirth, watching children starve because there was not enough food, was worse. Medieval women had, on average, 6 to 8 pregnancies if they married young and lived through their childbearing years. Many had more. 12, 14 pregnancies were not uncommon among women who lived to old age. And remember the mortality rates we discussed earlier. Somewhere between 30 and 60% chance of maternal death for each birth. Those odds added up terrifyingly over multiple pregnancies. A woman who had 6 births had perhaps a 1 in 3 or 1 in 2 chance of eventually dying in childbirth or from complications. Those are horrifying statistics. So women used whatever methods they could to limit births, despite the religious and legal prohibitions, despite the physical dangers. They took pennyroyal tea at night after their husbands slept. They shared information in whispers. They helped each other, risking their own safety to do so. Let me share a specific historical case that illustrates these dynamics. In Bologna in the year 1295, a woman named Guercia was banished from the city. The charge? She was accused of having sexual relations with other women using a dildo-like device. This case is extraordinary because female same-sex relationships are almost completely invisible in medieval records. We can only guess at how common or rare they were. But what this case tells us is that medieval authorities were deeply concerned with policing women's sexuality in all its forms. A woman who found sexual satisfaction outside of procreative marriage with a man was threatening the entire social order. Guercia's banishment was not just punishment, it was a warning to other women about the boundaries they must not cross. Medieval people also understood that not all sex happened within marriage. There were prostitutes in every medieval city, operating both legally in designated brothels and illegally in streets and taverns. There were adultery cases brought before church courts. There were accusations of fornication between unmarried people. There were same-sex relationships that occasionally surfaced in legal records. But we are not going to explore all of that tonight, because our focus is on wives, on married women's experiences. And for them, the night brought a particular set of challenges and occasional opportunities. Some women found genuine pleasure and intimacy with their husbands. Medieval literature, the bawdy tales, the fabliaux, the love poetry suggests that sexual satisfaction within marriage was considered desirable and sometimes achieved. Not all medieval marriages were loveless transactions. Some couples developed genuine affection and sexual compatibility, but many did not. Many marriages were arranged for economic or political reasons. Many couples barely knew each other on their wedding night. Many women married men much older than themselves, men they feared or disliked. For these women, the marital bed was a place of duty at best, violation at worst. As Anne lies beside Robert after he has fallen asleep, she thinks about these things. She counts days in her head, trying to remember when her last bleeding was, trying to calculate whether tonight might result in pregnancy. She hopes not, she prays not, but she knows that prayer might not be enough. She thinks about the pennyroyal growing in her kitchen garden. She thinks about whether she dares use it. She thinks about her sister, who died in childbirth 2 years ago. She thinks about her own body, about how tired she is, how much it already gives, how much more might be demanded of it. And she thinks, though she would never say this aloud, would barely admit it to herself, but how unfair it is that her body, her choices, her risks are all controlled by other people, by her husband, by the church, by the law, by social expectations, that the most intimate parts of her existence are not her own. This is the conjugal paradox. In the marital bed, a wife was supposed to be utterly submissive, her body entirely at her husband's disposal. And yet pregnancy and childbirth happened to her body, not his. The risks, the pain, the potential death, all hers. And so women found ways, small ways, dangerous ways to claim some autonomy, to negotiate, to resist, to protect themselves as much as they could within impossible constraints. The night is almost over now. Dawn will come soon. Anne will rise, will prepare breakfast, will care for her children, will work through another day. And when night comes again, the cycle will repeat. The negotiations will continue. The strategies will be employed. The silent, invisible struggle for bodily autonomy will go on, as it had for generations before her, and would for generations after. This is perhaps the most hidden aspect of medieval women's night lives, because it happened behind closed doors, between just two people, in a realm that society considered utterly private. And yet it was profoundly political. Control over reproduction is always political. Control over women's bodies is always about power. We have now witnessed so many dimensions of medieval women's secret night lives. The spinning, the brewing, the healing, the birthing, the business dealings, the prayers, the trading, and now this most intimate struggle. But there is still one more crucial role that women played in the darkness, one that has not yet been fully explored. We are going to discover that when their men were absent, away at war, away on business, away on pilgrimage, women became the protectors, the watchmen, the guardians of home and hearth against dangers both real and imagined. The widow's vigil we discussed was about business, but there was another kind of watching that fell to women, the watch for fire, for thieves, for wolves at the door. So stay with me as we explore how medieval wives became the night watchmen of their own small kingdoms, how they protected their children and homes through the darkest hours, and how this vigilance gave them yet another form of quiet, essential power. A noise, just a small sound in the darkness, a creak, a rustle, something that does not belong. Every mother knows this feeling. That instant snap from sleep to full alertness, heart pounding, senses straining. Is it one of the children? Is it an animal? Is it something worse? In a castle in Wales in the year 1348, Lady Eleanor sits up in bed. Her husband has been gone for 3 months, called to serve the king in France. She is alone, well, not entirely alone. She has servants, guards, children, but the ultimate responsibility for this estate, for these walls, for the safety of everyone within them, rests on her shoulders until her husband returns, if he returns. Tonight we are going to explore a role that medieval women played but that history rarely acknowledges. Women as guardians, as sentinels, as the last line of defence against the dangers that prowled in darkness. When men were absent, and men were frequently absent, women became the watchmen of their own domains, and the night was when that vigilance mattered most. Let us start with Lady Eleanor, because her situation represents one extreme of this responsibility. She is a noblewoman managing an entire castle estate in her husband's absence. This was not unusual. Medieval noblemen were often away for months or even years at a time. They went to war, they attended the king's court, they travelled to manage other properties, they went on pilgrimage, they participated in tournaments, and when they left, their wives took over everything. Everything. Think about what that means. Lady Eleanor is now responsible for the agricultural management of hundreds of acres of farmland. She oversees the work of dozens of servants and labourers, she collects rents from tenant farmers, she settles disputes, she manages the household finances, which are substantial. She ensures adequate food stores for winter. She maintains the physical structures, the castle walls, the barns, the mills. But most critically, especially at night, she is responsible for security. Medieval castles were not just homes, they were fortresses, designed to withstand attack. But fortifications only work if someone is watching, is ready, is able to respond to threat. And at night, when visibility is limited and attackers have the advantage of darkness, vigilance is everything. Eleanor makes her rounds each night before bed. She checks that the gates are barred. She speaks with the guards on the walls. There are only 4 tonight, fewer than her husband would typically post because some men went with him to France. She inspects the armory, making sure weapons are accessible. She checks the grain stores, which are valuable and tempting targets for thieves. She visits the stables, where horses are worth more than most people's annual income. Then she retires to the solar, the private living quarters. But she does not sleep deeply. She cannot afford to. Part of her mind is always alert, always listening. The noise that woke her tonight turns out to be nothing, just wind rattling a shutter. But it could have been raiders. It could have been thieves. It could have been the beginning of a siege. This was not paranoia. This was realistic assessment of danger. Medieval estates, especially during times of war or unrest, were vulnerable targets. Bandits knew when lords were absent. Rival nobles might see opportunity in a temporarily undefended castle. Even neighbours might attempt land grabs or cattle theft, gambling that a woman would not or could not defend her property. Some did gamble wrong. There are documented cases of women successfully defending estates, even castles, against military attack. In 1342, just 6 years before our story, a woman named Agnes Randolph defended Dunbar Castle in Scotland against an English siege for 5 months while her husband was imprisoned. She mocked the English commander from the walls, had her maids ostentatiously dust the battlements where English catapults had struck, and refused all demands to surrender. She won. The English eventually gave up and left. Or consider Nicola de la Haye, who was in her 60s when she successfully defended Lincoln Castle against French attack in 1217. Twice, she held out until relief forces arrived, maintaining order and discipline among her garrison, managing supplies, making tactical decisions. The king afterward appointed her Sheriff of Lincoln, one of the very few women to hold such a position, because she had proven herself more capable than most men. These were exceptional cases, but they illustrate that women could and did take military command when necessary. And even when it did not come to actual warfare, the constant vigilance, the readiness, the responsibility, these were burdens that fell to women with surprising frequency. Now, let us leave the castle and go to a very different kind of household. A peasant cottage in the north of England, the year 1390. The woman here is called Marjorie, and her husband is a labourer who travels seasonally for work. He's been gone for 6 weeks, helping with the wool harvest 2 villages away. He will be gone for at least 2 more weeks. Marjorie is alone with 3 young children in a 1-room cottage made of timber and thatch. The walls are thin. The door has a simple latch, no lock. The nearest neighbour is 50 paces away. At night, that might as well be a mile. What is Marjorie afraid of? Thieves, certainly. Her cottage holds almost nothing of value, but she has a few chickens, a goat, some stored grain. A desperate person might steal those. And a woman alone with children is seen as an easy target. There are also animals. Wolves still roam the English countryside in 1390. They rarely attack humans, but they will take livestock. A goat is precious. It provides milk, can be bred, represents real wealth for a peasant family. Losing it could mean the difference between survival and starvation, and there is fire. This is perhaps the greatest danger of all. A single spark from the hearth, a candle knocked over, thatch that is too dry. Medieval homes burned terrifyingly fast. Timber, straw, everything combustible. A fire that starts in one cottage can spread to an entire village within hours. So Marjorie's nighttime vigilance has multiple dimensions. Before she sleeps, she banks the fire carefully, covering the coals with ash so they will smoulder safely through the night without flame. She checks that no candles or oil lamps are still burning. She brings the goat inside, unusual, but safer than leaving it in the small shed where a wolf or thief could easily reach it. The goat smells terrible and the children complain, but Marjorie insists. She places a stick across the door latch, just a simple piece of wood wedged in place, but it provides a little additional security and would make noise if someone tried to force the door. She makes sure the water bucket is full and easily accessible in case fire breaks out. She positions her husband's work knife, the only weapon in the house, within reach of the sleeping area, and then she tries to sleep. But like Eleanor in her castle, Marjorie does not sleep deeply. She wakes multiple times through the night. Each time she listens, she sniffs the air, checking for smoke. She looks toward the door, making sure it remains closed. She reaches out to touch her children, reassuring herself they are still there, still safe. This is maternal vigilance raised to the level of survival skill. And millions of medieval mothers practiced it night after night after night. Can you feel the weight of that? The exhaustion of never fully resting, of always being the sentinel, of carrying the entire safety of your household on your shoulders. And remember, these women were also doing all the other night work we have discussed. Spinning, caring for sick children, rising for prayer. Their nights were fractured by multiple demands, and security was just one more burden. But there was also power in this role. A woman who successfully protected her household, who kept her children safe, who defended her property. That woman earned respect. She demonstrated capability that could not be dismissed or ignored. Let me tell you about a specific type of vigilance that was particularly important: fire watch. In medieval towns and villages, fire was the single greatest threat to communal safety. One house catches fire, and within hours, an entire neighborhood or town can be destroyed. This happened with horrifying regularity. London burned partially or completely multiple times throughout the medieval period. So communities organised fire watches, especially in summer when everything was tinder dry. Teams of people would patrol the streets at night, looking for any sign of fire, ready to raise the alarm. And women often served in these teams, particularly in areas where many men were away. There is a documented case from a German town in the 1300s where the town council officially appointed women to the fire watch during plague years when male mortality was high. These women walked the streets in pairs carrying lanterns, checking that all fires were properly contained, that no one had left anything smouldering or dangerous. They had authority to bang on doors, to demand entry if they smelled smoke, to enforce fire safety regulations. This was real power. These women could give orders to men, could fine people for violations, could literally save the town through their vigilance. And they did this at night, in darkness, with all the vulnerability and danger that entailed. Back in her cottage, Marjorie hears another sound. This time it is not wind or imagination. There are footsteps outside, heavy, deliberate. A man's footsteps. Her heart is pounding, her children are asleep. The goat bleats nervously, animals sense danger. Marjorie rises as quietly as she can, grabs the knife, positions herself between the door and her children. The footsteps stop at her door. A pause, then a voice. "Marjorie, It is your neighbour John. My wife is in labour and having trouble. The midwife has not arrived. Can you come? Relief washes over her. Not a threat. A call for help. And now Marjorie faces a different kind of decision. Does she leave her children alone to help with the birth? Does she wake them and bring them with her? Does she send John away, prioritising her own children's safety over the labouring woman's need? In the end, she wakes her oldest child, a girl of 9, and instructs her to bar the door after Marjorie leaves and to not open it for anyone except Marjorie's own voice. She takes the 2 younger children with her, the baby in her arms, the toddler holding her skirt. She goes to help. This is community. This is how people survived in medieval villages. Women helped each other through the night, even when it meant risk, even when it meant leaving their own homes unguarded. The networks of mutual aid that women created were stronger than any individual woman's ability to protect herself. Now let us return to Lady Eleanor in her castle. Dawn is approaching, and she has received news that changes everything. A messenger arrived in the middle of the night. She was woken by the guard, as she had instructed she should be, for any important news. The message is both welcome and terrifying. Her husband is returning, but he is bringing guests. The king himself will be stopping at their castle for 2 nights on his way north. The king, coming here in less than a week. Suddenly, Eleanor's responsibilities multiply exponentially. She must prepare the castle for a royal visit. That means food, extraordinary amounts of food, of extraordinary quality. It means ensuring the best chambers are spotless, properly furnished. It means organising entertainment, managing servants, coordinating with the surrounding estates to gather sufficient provisions. It means making sure nothing goes wrong, because failing to properly host the king could have serious political consequences for her husband. And she must do all this while her husband is still travelling, still days away. The entire success or failure of this royal visit rests on her preparation, her organisation, her competence. Does she panic? No, she's been trained for this her entire life. Noble women were educated specifically to manage large households, to handle complex logistics, to maintain social and political obligations. Eleanor begins immediately, even though it is not yet dawn, to organise her household. She wakes the steward, gives him instructions about supplies. She wakes the cook, discusses menus. She sends messengers to neighbouring estates requesting loans of plate and linens. She mentally inventories what entertainment can be arranged on short notice. Musicians, perhaps a local priest who tells good stories, hunting expeditions. By the time full daylight comes, Eleanor has already been working for 3 hours. She will continue working for the next week with very little sleep, and if the royal visit goes well, her husband will receive credit. But if anything goes wrong, she will receive blame. This is the paradox again. Women doing essential work, taking real responsibility, exercising genuine authority, but always in the background, always without official recognition, always subject to criticism but rarely receiving praise. We have seen this pattern throughout our journey tonight. Women spinning thread that becomes the fabric of civilization, but nameless in the historical record. Women brewing ale that kept medieval England hydrated, but later accused of witchcraft. Women healing with herbs, but suspected of poison. Women attending births, but excluded from medical professions. Women running businesses, but struggling against legal restrictions. Women praying through the night, but claiming authority only through divine connection. Women protecting their homes, but denied official military or security roles. And now, as dawn truly arrives and the medieval night finally ends, we have come nearly to the end of our journey. But there is one more crucial dimension we must explore. Because we have talked about all the ways individual women navigated the night, all the roles they played, all the work they did, But we have not yet talked about the networks, the webs of connection and support that women created with each other. We have not fully examined the dark sisterhood, the communities of women that existed in shadow, that sustained each other through the darkest hours. So stay with me for just a little longer as we explore how medieval women built systems of mutual support that were invisible to men but absolutely essential to survival. We are going to see how the female networks we have glimpsed throughout our journey, the women gathering to spin, the midwives calling on each other, the traders sharing information, the neighbours helping through labour, all connect into something larger, something that gave women collective strength even when they had very little individual power. 3 soft knocks, a pause, then 2 more, the signal that means safe, trusted, come in. The door opens and 5 women slip into the small room, one by one, moving quietly despite the hour. It is past midnight in a village near Canterbury, the year 1412. These women have known each other for years, some since childhood. They are neighbours, friends, relatives by marriage. But tonight, they are something more specific. They are conspirators. Not in anything illegal exactly, but in something the world of men would rather not know about. They have gathered to help one of their own, and what they are about to do exists in that grey space between acceptable and forbidden, between community care and subversive resistance. Throughout our journey, we have caught glimpses of these female networks, women spinning together, midwives calling on each other, traders sharing information, neighbours responding to childbirth emergencies. But now we're going to look directly at these bonds, at how medieval women created systems of mutual support that operated almost entirely in darkness, invisible to official record, yet absolutely vital to survival. This is the story of the Dark Sisterhood, and it is more radical than you might expect. The woman who called this gathering is named Emma. She is 28 years old, married to a man who beats her. Everyone in the village knows it. You can see the bruises when she goes to market, though she tries to cover them. Her husband drinks too much, works too little, and takes his frustrations out on Emma's body. Under medieval law, this is completely legal. A husband has the right to physically discipline his wife, to correct her behaviour. But Emma has finally had enough. She is leaving, and these women are here to help her do it. Let me be clear about how extraordinary this is. A married woman in medieval England could not just leave her husband. Legally, she had no independent existence. She could not own property in her own name. She could not make contracts. She could not legally live separately from her husband. If she tried to leave, he had every right to drag her back. And if anyone helped her leave, they could be prosecuted for interfering in a marriage. And yet, women helped each other escape dangerous marriages all the time. We know this because occasionally these cases appear in court records, always from the perspective of angry husbands trying to get their wives back. But for every case that made it to court, there must have been dozens or hundreds that never did, that succeeded through careful planning and collective silence. Tonight, these 5 women are Emma's escape network. Each has a specific role, and they have planned this carefully over weeks of whispered conversations in the church after Mass, during trips to the market while washing clothes together at the stream. Alice, the oldest of the group, has arranged for Emma to stay with her sister in a town 20 miles away. The sister is a widow who runs a small boarding house. Emma can work there as a servant, and her husband will have no way of knowing where she went. Joan has gathered clothing and a few personal items from Emma's house when the husband was not home, just small things that will not be missed immediately but that Emma will need. Mary has saved money from her own spinning work, 3 whole shillings, which she is giving to Emma for travel and to help her get established. Sarah knows the route to the next town and has arranged for a carter she trusts to give Emma a ride, asking no questions in the pre-dawn hours. And Beatrice, the youngest, will stay behind and spread a careful story that Emma went to visit a sick relative, or perhaps to go on pilgrimage, or something else plausible that might give Emma a few days' head start before her husband realizes she is not coming back. Is this legal? No. Is it moral? These women think so. They have watched Emma suffer for years. They have seen her with black eyes, with split lips, limping from kicks. They know her husband is dangerous, and they have decided that the law is wrong, that their friend's life is more important than her husband's property rights. Do you see the radicalism here? These are not noble women or scholars or rebels making a political statement. These are ordinary peasant and working-class women who have looked at the laws of their society and decided those laws are unjust. And they are breaking those laws together, risking prosecution to save one of their own. This kind of collective action happened far more often than records reveal. Women created underground networks to protect each other from abuse, to help each other escape impossible situations, to provide support that the official world would not. But female solidarity in the night extended far beyond helping women escape. It was woven through every aspect of medieval life. Remember the birthing chamber we visited? The 7 women who gathered around a labouring mother? That was not just tradition, that was a mutual aid network. Each of those women knew that when her own time came, the others would be there for her. They were investing in a system of reciprocal care, and it was not just about childbirth. When a woman was sick, other women came to nurse her, to do her work, to watch her children. When a woman's husband died, other women appeared at her door with food, with companionship, with practical help. When a woman needed to borrow a cooking pot or a sindel or a bit of grain to tide her over until harvest, she asked another woman, and that woman shared because she knew she might need the same help someday. These networks were formalized in some places through religious organizations called confraternities or guilds. There were women's guilds attached to churches, where women paid small dues and in return received support when they were sick, help with funeral costs when family members died, prayers said for their souls. These were essentially medieval insurance and social welfare systems created by and for women. In Paris in the 1400s, there was a confraternity of women dedicated to St. Catherine. The members were working women, servants, laundresses, spinsters, small traders. They met regularly, contributed to a common fund, and helped each other in times of crisis. If a member could not work due to illness, the confraternity paid her rent and bought her food. If a member's daughter needed a dowry to marry, the confraternity contributed. If a member was accused of a crime, the confraternity helped pay for legal defense. This was women taking care of women in a world that offered them very little official support. But not all female networks were formalized. Many existed entirely in shadow, bound by nothing more than trust and shared interest. Think about the alewives we discussed. They competed with each other for customers, but they also supported each other against male brewers who wanted to push them out of the trade. There are records of alewives testifying in court on each other's behalf, vouching for each other's character and business practices. There are records of alewives lending each other equipment, sharing recipes, warning each other about dishonest suppliers. Or think about the wise women, the healers with their herbal knowledge. They guarded their knowledge carefully, passing it only to women they trusted. But within that trusted circle, they shared freely. A healer in one village might send a patient to a healer in another village if that healer had expertise in a particular ailment. They consulted with each other about difficult cases. They trained each other's daughters. This was a knowledge network, a professional network, operating entirely outside official channels. And then there were the information networks like Bess, the night trader we met earlier. Women who collected and distributed news, who knew everyone's business, who facilitated connections. These women were the social glue of medieval communities. They knew who needed work and who was hiring. They knew which families were struggling and which could afford to help. They knew the gossip, yes, but gossip was not trivial. It was information about reputation, about trustworthiness, about who could be relied on and who could not. Medieval society officially despised gossip, associated it with women, saw it as frivolous and potentially sinful. Church sermons railed against gossips. Laws punished women for slander. There were even physical punishments. The scold's bridle, a metal cage locked around a woman's head to prevent her from speaking, used against women accused of gossip or scolding. But here is what those authorities did not understand or did not want to acknowledge. Gossip was power. Information was power. Knowing everyone's secrets, knowing the connection between people, knowing what was really happening beneath the surface, that was valuable, and women controlled it. Let me tell you about the origin of the word gossip itself, because it reveals something beautiful. Gossip comes from the Old English godsib, meaning god-sibling or god-parent. A gossip was originally someone who stood as sponsor at a baptism, who had a spiritual connection to a child and its family. Over time, the word came to mean any close female friend, particularly the women who gathered at births and baptisms, and only later did it take on the negative meaning of idle talk. So when medieval authorities complained about gossips, they were actually complaining about women's intimate friendships, about the bonds between women that created obligations and loyalties that men could not control. The women helping Emma escape, they are gossips in the original sense. They are bound by spiritual and emotional ties that are stronger than law, stronger than fear of punishment. As the night wears on and dawn approaches, Emma prepares to leave. The women embrace her, each whispering blessings and advice. Alice reminds her to send word through trusted channels once she is settled, so they will know she is safe. Joan makes Emma swear to find the local church as soon as she arrives, to seek sanctuary if her husband somehow tracks her down. Mary presses the coins into Emma's hand and will not let her refuse, and then Emma slips out into the pre-dawn darkness, where Sarah is waiting to lead her to the carter. The other women disperse to their own homes, to their own beds, to catch a few hours of sleep before the day's work begins. Will Emma's escape succeed? We do not know. The historical record is silent on this specific case because I have created this scene based on documented patterns, not on any single recorded event. But we know that some women succeeded in leaving and starting new lives. We know that networks like this existed and functioned. We also know that many attempts failed. Husbands tracked down runaway wives. Communities refused to harbour them. The law forced them to return, and then the beatings got worse, because now the woman had demonstrated disobedience, had embarrassed her husband publicly. But the networks persisted. Women kept helping each other despite the risks, because what else could they do? Watch their friends suffer and do nothing. There were other, darker networks too. Networks of women accused of witchcraft often turned out to be women who supported each other, who shared herbal knowledge, who attended births together. The witch trials of the later medieval and early modern period deliberately targeted these female networks, seeing them, correctly, as threats to patriarchal authority. When witch hunters accused multiple women from the same community, they were often women who knew each other, who had worked together, who were part of informal networks. The trials forced these women to testify against each other, to break their bonds of loyalty under torture and threat of execution. It was a systematic destruction of female solidarity. But we are not quite to that dark chapter yet, not in most of Europe in the early 1400s. For now, the networks persist. For now, women still gather in the darkness, still share their knowledge, still protect each other. Let me share one more form of network, one we have not discussed yet: the networks between social classes. Medieval society was rigidly hierarchical. A noble woman and a peasant woman were separated by enormous gulfs of wealth, power, and legal status. And yet, there were connections. A noble woman needed midwives, healers, wet nurses, servants. She depended on women from lower classes for essential services, and sometimes these working relationships became something more. Not friendship exactly, because the power imbalance was too great, but a kind of mutual respect and obligation. There are documented cases of noble women using their influence to protect lower-class women from prosecution. There are cases of noblewomen paying for medical care or providing refuge to women fleeing abusive situations. There are cases of wealthy women bequeathing money or property to their female servants, recognizing years of loyal service. Was this pure altruism? No, it was also self-interest. A noblewoman's comfort and security depended on maintaining good relationships with the women who served her. But it created connections across class lines that were rare in medieval society. And in the darkness, in the private spaces where status was less visible, these connections could become more genuine. A noble woman in labor was just as vulnerable, just as afraid, just as dependent on the midwife's skill as any peasant woman. Pain and fear are great levelers. As morning light begins to touch the horizon, the women of this village are all in their separate homes, all feigning sleep or just waking, all going about their normal routines. No one looking at them would know what they did tonight. No one would know the decision they made together, the risk they took, the line they crossed. And that's exactly the point. Female solidarity in the medieval world had to be invisible to survive. It had to operate in shadow, in code, in ways that did not openly challenge male authority, but that nonetheless created spaces where women could act, could choose, could help each other. These networks were fragile. They depended on trust, on discretion, on women prioritizing each other, despite the very real incentives to compete and betray. A woman who informed on another woman might win favor with male authorities. A woman who refused to help might avoid risk. But enough women, enough of the time, chose solidarity. And that made all the difference. We have traveled through so many dark hours together, witnessed so many dimensions of medieval women's secret night lives. We have seen them work, pray, trade, heal, give birth, negotiate, resist. We have seen them as individuals struggling to survive in a world that gave them very little power. But we've also glimpsed something larger, a shadow world of female connection and mutual support that existed alongside and despite the official patriarchal structures. And now, as we approach our final part, we must ask, what happened to these secret night lives? How did they end, and what traces did they leave behind? Because the world changed. The medieval period gave way to the early modern era. New technologies, new economies, new religious movements, new forms of social control emerged, and the secret spaces where women had operated began to close. In our final part, we are going to witness the twilight of an era, the moment when the night began to change in ways that would push women's secret lives even deeper underground, or erase them entirely. So stay with me for one last chapter as we explore what was lost, what survived, and what we can still hear if we listen carefully to the darkness. The year is 1536. In England, something unprecedented is happening. King Henry VIII has broken with the Catholic Church, and now his commissioners are travelling the country systematically dismantling the monasteries. Convents where nuns have prayed through the night for centuries are being emptied. The buildings are being stripped of their valuables, sometimes torn down completely. The nuns are being turned out with small pensions, told to return to secular life, to find husbands if they can, to disappear into a world that no longer has a place for them. In one convent in Yorkshire, an elderly nun named Sister Margaret watches as soldiers inventory the contents of the chapel. She has lived here for 53 years since she was 15 years old. She has risen for matins at 2 in the morning nearly 20,000 times. She knows every stone of these walls, every note of the plain chant, every prayer by heart. And now it is ending, not just for her, but for an entire way of life. The dissolution of the monasteries, as historians call it, was one of the most dramatic social upheavals in English history. Between 1536 and 1541, more than 800 monasteries, convents and friaries were closed. Thousands of monks and nuns were displaced. Centuries of tradition were erased in just 5 years. But the dissolution was not just about religion. It was also about economics and gender. Because convents had been one of the few places where women could live independently of men, where they could be educated, where they could hold authority. Abbesses had managed vast estates, had wielded political influence, had controlled substantial wealth. Some convents owned more land than many nobles, and now that was gone. The land was seized by the crown and sold to wealthy men, the power disappeared, and the women were scattered. Sister Margaret is eventually placed with a family as a housekeeper. She, who had once been part of a community of 30 women who had participated in the governance of an estate, who had copied manuscripts and tended the sick and taught young novices, she is now a servant in a household that barely tolerates her, seen as a relic of the old discredited religion. At night, she tries to pray the old hours, but she is alone. There is no chapel, no candles, no community of voices raised together in the darkness. There is just her, whispering prayers in a cold attic room, trying to hold on to something that the world has decided should not exist. This is what the end of an era looks like. Not dramatic, not all at once, but in the quiet erasure of spaces and practices that had sustained women for generations. The dissolution is just one example, one moment in a longer process of change that began in the late 1500s and accelerated through the 1600s and 1700s. The world was transforming in ways that would fundamentally alter women's relationship to the night and to the work they had done in darkness. Let me walk you through some of these changes, because understanding what was lost helps us appreciate what medieval women had built. First, the brewing industry. We talked about the alewives, how women had dominated brewing for centuries. But starting in the 1500s, professional breweries emerged, using expensive equipment that women could not afford. These breweries were licensed by the government, and licenses went almost exclusively to men. Guild regulations became stricter, explicitly excluding women. The association of alewives with witchcraft, remember those pointed hats and cauldrons, made the occupation increasingly dangerous for women. By 1700, brewing in England was almost entirely a male profession. The knowledge women had held, the techniques they had perfected, the economic independence they had earned, all of it was taken over by men. Women were pushed back into purely domestic brewing, making small amounts of ale for their own families, with no economic benefit. Second, midwifery. For centuries, midwifery had been women's exclusive domain, but starting in the 1600s, male physicians began to encroach on the profession. They had no more training or expertise than female midwives, often less, because they had not actually attended births, but they had access to medical education, to professional licenses, to social authority that women lacked. Slowly, wealthy women began hiring male physicians for difficult births instead of midwives. Male physicians used forceps, a new tool that midwives were forbidden to use because it was considered a surgical instrument. The fact that forceps often caused more harm than good was beside the point. They represented modern scientific medicine, while midwives represented old superstitious tradition. By the 1800s, midwifery had become a low-status occupation in much of Europe, associated with poverty and ignorance. The skilled practitioners who had safely delivered millions of babies, who had accumulated generations of practical knowledge, were dismissed as backwards and dangerous. Third, textile work. The spinning and weaving that had been central to women's economic lives began to move out of the home and into factories. The Industrial Revolution, starting in the 1700s, mechanized textile production. Factories with power looms could produce cloth faster and cheaper than hand weavers. The spinning wheel, and before it the spindle and distaff, became obsolete. Women did work in the early factories, in terrible conditions for low wages with no control over their labour. But the home-based textile work that had allowed women some independence, some control over their time, some ability to balance childcare with income, that disappeared. Fourth, herbal medicine. As professional medicine became more established and regulated, folk healing was increasingly dismissed as quackery or worse. The wise women with their herbal knowledge were labelled as ignorant at best, dangerous at worst. Some were accused of witchcraft. The great witch trials of the 16 and 1700s specifically targeted women healers. Tens of thousands of women were executed across Europe and colonial America, many of them accused of using herbs and healing knowledge for evil purposes. The knowledge itself was not evil, of course. But in a changing world that wanted clear professional boundaries and male control of medical practice, folk healers were threats that needed to be eliminated. By 1800, herbal medicine was marginal, practiced only by the poorest people who could not afford professional doctors. Much of the knowledge was lost entirely. Plants that medieval women had used successfully for centuries were forgotten, their uses unrecorded because the women who knew them could not write, and the men who could write did not think their knowledge was worth preserving. Do you see the pattern? Again and again, skills and knowledge that women had held were either taken over by men or devalued into insignificance. The economic opportunities that women had created in the margins and shadows were closed off. The spaces where women had exercised autonomy, the birthing chamber, the brewing house, the healing room, even the convent, were invaded by male authority or shut down entirely. And what about the night itself? Did it change? Yes, gradually then dramatically. Street lighting was introduced in major cities, first with oil lamps in the 1700s, then with gas lights in the 1800s, finally with electric lights in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The absolute darkness that had defined medieval nights disappeared. With light came more activity. The strict curfews relaxed. Night work became more common, but now it was factory work, shift work, controlled by employers rather than by women working in their own homes on their own schedules. The night lost its mystery, its danger, and also its potential for female autonomy. It became just an extension of day, subject to the same surveillance and control. But here is what I want you to understand. These changes did not happen smoothly or inevitably. Women resisted. They fought to keep their occupations, their knowledge, their spaces of autonomy. There are documented cases of female brewers protesting new regulations, of midwives defending their practices in court, of wise women continuing to heal despite accusations and danger. The networks of female solidarity that we discussed, those did not disappear either. They went deeper underground, became even more invisible, but they persisted. Women continued to help each other through childbirth, through illness, through domestic violence, through poverty. The forms changed, but the fundamental reality of women supporting women continued. And some knowledge survived. Herbal remedies were passed down through families, mother to daughter to granddaughter, even when they were no longer publicly acknowledged as medicine. Midwifery skills survived in rural areas where male physicians could not or would not go. The tradition of women's mutual aid continued through quilting circles, church groups, neighborhood associations. Modern feminism, when it emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries, was building on foundations that medieval women had laid. The idea that women should support each other, should create their own networks, should claim economic independence and control over their own bodies, these were not new ideas. They were ideas that had been practiced in shadow for centuries, that had survived countless attempts at suppression, that had been passed down through generations of women who refused to be entirely silenced. Sister Margaret, the nun we met at the beginning of this part, died in 1554, 18 years after her convent was dissolved. She was 71 years old, which was remarkably old for that era. In her final months, she was cared for by a woman named Elizabeth, who had been a servant in the household where Margaret worked. Elizabeth had learned that Margaret was once a nun, that she knew herbal remedies and prayers for healing, and Elizabeth sought her out, asked her to teach her what she knew. So in the last weeks of her life, by candlelight in whispered conversations, Sister Margaret passed on what she remembered, the uses of certain herbs, the prayers for safe childbirth, the songs that had been sung in the convent chapel at Matins. Elizabeth could not write, so none of this was recorded, but she remembered, and perhaps she taught her own daughter, and the knowledge travelled forward in time, invisible, resilient. This is how women's history survives, not in official documents or grand narratives, but in fragments, in whispers, in practices that persist long after their origins are forgotten. Tonight we have travelled together through 8 centuries of darkness. We have met women whose names we will never know, who left almost no trace in the historical record, but whose work and whose courage shape the world we live in now. We have seen them spin thread by the light of precious candles, creating the fabric that clothed medieval Europe. We have seen them brew ale that kept communities hydrated and healthy. We have seen them mix remedies that genuinely healed. We have seen them attend births, saving lives through skill and compassion. We have seen them run businesses, manage estates, defend castles. We have seen them pray through the night, seeking connection with the divine. We have seen them trade in shadow markets, creating economic survival where official systems failed them. We have seen them negotiate the impossible constraints of marriage and sexuality. We have seen them watch through the darkness, protecting their homes and families. And we have seen them support each other, creating networks of solidarity that sustained them through dangers both physical and spiritual. These were the secret night lives of medieval wives. Secret because men did not see them or did not think them important enough to record. Secret because women deliberately operated in shadow to maintain whatever autonomy they could. Secret because the world that these women built, the world of female knowledge and female community and female resistance, was one that patriarchal society would rather deny existed. But it did exist, and if you listen carefully, you can still hear echoes of it. When modern women gather to support a friend through crisis, when we share knowledge that official systems do not teach, when we create networks of mutual aid, when we claim our bodies as our own, when we work through the night to build something meaningful, we are walking paths that medieval women carved out in darkness centuries ago. The medieval night is gone. The world has changed beyond anything Sister Margaret or Eleanor or Marjorie or any of the women we have met would recognize. But the fundamental challenge remains. How do women create lives of meaning, dignity, and autonomy in a world that often denies us all three? How do we support each other through darkness, literal and metaphorical? How do we preserve and pass on knowledge that the dominant culture devalues or ignores? These are not medieval questions. These are human questions, eternal questions, questions that every generation of women must answer anew. So as dawn breaks on our journey together, as the medieval night finally fades into history, I want you to remember, you are part of this lineage. The struggles and the strategies, the courage and the community, the night work and the shadow networks, all of it flows forward to you. Every woman who has ever whispered advice to another woman, who has ever shared forbidden knowledge, who has ever helped another woman survive, she is your ancestor, whether you are related by blood or not. The night is not what it once was, but the need for solidarity, for mutual support, for spaces where women can act and speak and choose, that need has not disappeared. It has only transformed, as it has transformed countless times before. Thank you for traveling with me through these dark hours, for listening to stories that history tried to silence. I hope you see medieval women differently now, not as passive victims or romantic figures, but as real, complicated people who worked incredibly hard, who made difficult choices, who survived against long odds, and who built things of value in spaces where they were told nothing of value could exist. If this journey has moved you, I would love to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which part of this story resonated most with you. Tell me about the women in your own life, past or present, who have done night work of their own, who have held things together in darkness, who have passed on knowledge and strength. And please, subscribe to this channel so we can continue exploring hidden histories together. Give this video a like if it has taught you something, challenged you, or simply given you something to think about in the quiet hours. Because there are so many more stories to tell, so many more voices that deserve to be heard, so many more journeys through history's shadows that are waiting to be taken. Until we meet again, in whatever darkness or light awaits, remember, you walk in the footsteps of women who survived impossible things. You carry knowledge they fought to preserve. You are part of a sisterhood that stretches back through centuries, that will stretch forward through centuries more. The medieval night is over, but the work continues, and we continue it together. Sleep well and dream of all the women who worked while the world slept, who loved in defiance of law, who healed despite danger, who taught despite prohibition, who built despite opposition. They are with us still if we remember them, if we honor them by living fully, by supporting each other, by refusing to accept that darkness means the end of possibility. Thank you for listening, thank you for caring, and thank you for carrying these stories forward into whatever mornings await us all.